The autumn air carried the scent of dying leaves and damp earth as Zachary Moore adjusted the scope on his rifle for the third time that morning. At 34, he had been hunting these eastern Oklahoma woods since he was 12 years old, following in the footsteps of his father, James Moore, and his grandfather before him. The Moore family had been working this land for 3 generations, first as tenant farmers, then as owners of a modest 160-acre spread that bordered the Ouachita National Forest. Zachary's calloused hands, permanently stained with motor oil from his day job at Patterson's Auto Repair, moved with practiced precision as he checked his equipment one final time. His Remington 700.308 Winchester had served him well for over a decade, putting meat on the table and keeping the family tradition alive. The rifle's wooden stock bore the scratches and dings of countless hunting trips, each mark a memory etched in wood and steel. The wild hog problem had been escalating for months across southeastern Oklahoma. These weren't the domestic pigs that had escaped local farms decades ago and gone feral. These were massive, intelligent animals that had adapted to the dense forests and creek bottoms, multiplying at an alarming rate. They destroyed crops, tore up pastures, and posed a genuine threat to livestock and property. The state had even lifted restrictions on hog hunting, encouraging year-round elimination of the invasive species. Zachary's friend Marcus Webb had called him 3 days earlier, his voice tight with frustration. Marcus owned a cattle operation about 15 miles southeast of Zachary's place, right up against the forest boundary. "Zach, these damn hogs are tearing hell out of my north pasture," Marcus had said, the phone crackling with poor reception. "Found 3 of them yesterday morning, big as hell, rooting around my prize Angus breeding area. I'm talking boars that'll go 300 pounds easy. You interested in helping me thin them out?" The offer had come at the perfect time. Zachary's wife, Sarah, was visiting her sister in Tulsa for 2 weeks, taking their 8-year-old daughter, Emma, for an extended cousin bonding experience. The auto shop was slow with the harvest season ending, and Zachary found himself with more free time than he'd had in years. The prospect of several days camping and hunting without the usual constraints of family and work schedules felt like exactly what he needed. Marcus had specific instructions when Zachary arrived at the ranch that previous Monday afternoon. "The worst damage is happening along Bitter Creek, where it curves through my north section," Marcus explained, pointing to a detailed topographical map spread across his kitchen table. "There's an old logging road that'll get you within half a mile of the creek bottom. The hogs are coming through there around dawn and dusk, following the water source." The area Marcus described was familiar territory to Zachary. He had hunted deer there as a teenager, back when old Mr. Henderson owned the property. The creek bottom was thick with oak, hickory, and sweet gum trees, creating a natural corridor for wildlife movement. The terrain rolled gently from the creek up to higher ground, with plenty of thick cover for both predator and prey. "I've got an old line shack about 1.5 miles from where you'll be hunting," Marcus continued. "Nothing fancy, but it's got a wood stove, basic supplies, and it'll keep you dry if the weather turns bad. You're welcome to use it as base camp for as long as you need." Zachary had spent Sunday afternoon preparing for the hunt, with the methodical attention to detail that had made him successful both as a mechanic and a hunter. His gear was spread across the garage floor. Sleeping bag rated for 20 degrees, camp stove and fuel, 3 days worth of food, first aid kit, GPS unit, headlamp, extra batteries, and enough ammunition for any reasonable hunting scenario. He packed everything in a military surplus backpack that had belonged to his father during his army days in the early 1980s. The drive to Marcus's ranch took just over an hour, winding through rural roads that grew progressively narrower and more isolated. Zachary's Ford F-150, its odometer showing over 200,000 miles, handled the rough gravel roads with familiar ease. The truck had been his constant companion for hunting trips across 3 states, its bed equipped with a tonneau cover and toolboxes that held everything from tire repair kits to emergency rations. Monday evening had been spent getting oriented to the new hunting area. Zachary hiked the old logging road, noting fresh hog sign along the creek bottom. The damage Marcus had described was extensive. Areas of torn-up earth 20 feet square where the hogs had rooted for acorns and grubs, mud wallows carved out along the creek bank, and countless tracks in the soft soil. These weren't just a few hogs passing through. This was an established population using the area as a major feeding ground. The line shack proved to be better than Marcus had advertised. Built in the 1960s by a timber company, the small structure was constructed from native stone and rough-cut lumber. It featured one room with a stone fireplace, a basic kitchen area with a hand pump for well water, and a small loft accessible by a wooden ladder. The roof was solid metal sheeting that had weathered to a rusty brown, and the windows, though small, provided good visibility in all directions. Tuesday morning brought Zachary's first successful encounter with the hog population. He had positioned himself before dawn along a game trail that showed heavy use, settling into a natural ground blind created by a fallen oak tree. The morning was crisp and clear, with just enough wind to mask any human scent, but not enough to affect shot placement. The first group appeared just after sunrise, a sow with 3 half-grown piglets moving cautiously along the creek bank. Zachary watched them through his scope for nearly 10 minutes, studying their behavior and movement patterns. The sow was constantly alert, testing the air and scanning the surrounding forest for threats. When she finally led her family into an open area near the creek, Zachary took his shot. The .308 round dropped the largest piglet cleanly, the report of the rifle echoing off the creek banks and rolling through the forest. The remaining hogs scattered immediately, crashing through the underbrush with surprising speed for animals of their size. Within seconds, the forest had returned to its previous quiet, broken only by the sound of running water and the distant call of a crow. Field dressing the 60-pound pig took Zachary about 30 minutes. He worked efficiently, his knife moving with practiced strokes as he prepared the animal for transport back to the line shack. The meat would provide several good meals during his stay, and the successful hunt confirmed that Marcus's intelligence about hog activity in the area was accurate. Wednesday brought a change in the weather that would prove significant in the days to come. A cold front moved through during the night, dropping temperatures by 20 degrees and bringing with it a steady, cold rain that would continue intermittently for the next 48 hours. The weather change seemed to alter the behavior of the local wildlife, making the hogs more cautious and forcing Zachary to adapt his hunting strategy. Instead of the dawn and dusk pattern he had observed on Tuesday, the hogs seemed to be moving throughout the day, taking advantage of the overcast conditions that provided better concealment. Zachary spent Wednesday morning scouting new areas along the creek, looking for fresh sign and alternative hunting locations. It was during this scouting expedition that he first noticed something unusual. About half a mile upstream from his previous hunting location, Zachary discovered a series of tracks in the soft mud along the creek bank that didn't match anything in his considerable experience. The impressions were human-like, but far larger than any human foot he had ever seen. Each track measured nearly 18 inches long and 8 inches wide, with clear toe impressions that showed a foot structure similar to a human, but proportionally different. The tracks were deeply impressed in the mud, suggesting an animal of considerable weight. Based on the depth of the impressions and his knowledge of how tracks formed in different soil conditions, Zachary estimated that whatever had made these tracks weighed at least 400 pounds, possibly more. The stride length between tracks was over 4 feet, indicating an animal with extremely long legs. Zachary's first instinct was to rationalize what he was seeing. Perhaps a bear had walked through the area, leaving tracks that had been distorted by subsequent rain. Oklahoma did have a small black bear population, and while rare in this part of the state, it wasn't impossible. But as he examined the tracks more closely, using his hunting knife to scrape away layers of mud and debris, the explanation became increasingly unlikely. Bears walked on four legs, occasionally rearing up on their hind legs for short distances. These tracks showed a consistent bipedal pattern, with no corresponding front paw prints anywhere in the vicinity. The spacing and depth were remarkably consistent, indicating a smooth, efficient gait rather than the awkward movement of a bear walking upright. More disturbing was the apparent age of the tracks. Based on the way rain had affected the impressions and the accumulation of debris in the depressions, Zachary estimated they had been made sometime Tuesday night or early Wednesday morning. The creature that made them had passed through this area recently, possibly while Zachary was sleeping in the line shack less than 2 miles away. Zachary spent over an hour photographing and measuring the tracks with his digital camera and a folding ruler from his pack. He took shots from multiple angles, including close-ups of individual toe impressions and wide shots showing the stride pattern. The photos would serve as documentation of his discovery, though he wasn't sure what he planned to do with them. Following the track line upstream, Zachary discovered additional evidence that deepened the mystery. About 200 yards from the initial tracks, he found where the creature had apparently stopped to drink from the creek. The muddy bank showed knee impressions, where something had knelt down, and the grass on the higher ground above the creek showed clear signs of disturbance where something large had rested. Most unsettling was a partial handprint pressed into the mud near the water's edge. Like the footprints, it was far larger than any human hand, but the finger arrangement and thumb position were distinctly human-like. The print showed incredible detail, including what appeared to be fingerprint ridges on the palm area. By Wednesday afternoon, the steady rain had begun to wash away the clearest track impressions, but Zachary had documented everything he could find. He returned to the line shack with his head spinning with questions and theories. His practical mechanical mind struggled to process what he had observed, searching for rational explanations that seemed increasingly elusive. That evening, Zachary sat by the fire in the line shack, studying the photos on his camera's LCD screen and trying to make sense of what he had discovered. He considered calling Marcus to report the strange tracks, but what would he say? That he had found evidence of some unknown creature wandering around the cattle ranch? Marcus would think he had been drinking or had spent too much time alone in the woods. The rain continued through Wednesday night, drumming steadily on the metal roof of the line shack. Zachary found himself listening to every sound in the forest, his hunter's instincts heightened by the day's discoveries. Twice during the night, he heard branches breaking in the distance, sounds that could have been deer or hogs moving through the forest, but which now seemed potentially more sinister. Thursday morning dawned clear and cold, with a brilliant blue sky and sharp visibility that made every detail of the forest stand out in crystal clarity. The rain had stopped sometime before dawn, leaving the woods dripping and fresh-washed. Zachary decided to expand his search for the mysterious creature, following the creek downstream toward areas he hadn't yet explored. The downstream section of Bitter Creek wound through progressively denser forest, with thicker canopy cover and more complex terrain. The creek itself meandered through a series of small valleys and ridges, creating numerous hiding places and secluded areas where a large animal could remain concealed. The vegetation was different here too, with more pine mixed in among the hardwoods and thick tangles of wild grape and greenbrier that created nearly impenetrable barriers in some areas. About a mile downstream from his previous tracking location, Zachary made another significant discovery. In a small clearing beside the creek, he found what could only be described as a temporary shelter or resting place. Several large branches had been arranged in a rough lean-to configuration against a massive oak tree, with smaller branches and leaves piled underneath to create a crude bed. The construction showed clear signs of intelligence and purpose. The branches hadn't fallen naturally, they had been deliberately broken and arranged to provide shelter from rain and wind. The bed area was large enough to accommodate something the size of a large man, but the scale suggested an occupant considerably larger than any human. Around the shelter site, Zachary found additional evidence of occupation. A circle of stones near the creek suggested a fire ring, though there were no signs of recent burning. Several large rocks had been moved into positions that didn't appear natural, creating what looked like crude seats or work surfaces. Most intriguingly, Zachary discovered what appeared to be tool marks on several nearby trees. Deep scratches in the bark, about 8 feet off the ground, showed a regular pattern that suggested they had been made deliberately rather than by random animal activity. The scratches were too high to have been made by bears and showed a precision that seemed to indicate intelligence. As Zachary examined the shelter site, he began to feel increasingly uneasy. The evidence suggested not just an unknown animal, but an intelligent creature that was capable of using tools and creating structures. The implications were both fascinating and terrifying. If such a creature existed in these woods, what else might he discover? The feeling of being watched began sometime around mid-morning as Zachary continued his exploration of the downstream area. At first, it was just a vague uneasiness, the kind of feeling hunters sometimes got when they sensed predators in the area. But as the morning progressed, the sensation became more pronounced and specific. Several times, Zachary caught glimpses of movement in his peripheral vision, but when he turned to look directly, he saw nothing unusual. The forest seemed to close in around him, and sounds that should have been familiar and comforting began to seem ominous and threatening. The call of a crow became a warning cry. The rustle of squirrels in the leaves sounded like something much larger moving through the underbrush. By noon, Zachary had decided to return to the line shack and reconsider his situation. The evidence he had collected was compelling, but the growing sense of unease was affecting his judgment and his safety awareness. He needed time to process what he had discovered and decide on his next course of action. The return trip to the line shack took longer than expected. Zachary found himself moving more cautiously, stopping frequently to listen and scan the surrounding forest. The feeling of being observed intensified rather than diminished as he moved away from the downstream area, suggesting that whatever was watching him was following his movements. About halfway back to the line shack, Zachary stopped at a high point overlooking the creek valley to rest and observe the area he had just left. Using his binoculars, he scanned the forest methodically, looking for any sign of movement or unusual activity. For several minutes, he saw nothing out of the ordinary. Then, at the extreme range of his binoculars, Zachary caught a glimpse of something that made his blood run cold. Moving through the trees near the shelter site he had discovered earlier was a dark figure that appeared to be walking upright on 2 legs. The figure was visible for only a few seconds before disappearing behind a stand of pine trees. But in that brief glimpse, Zachary could see that it was far larger than any human. The creature moved with a fluid, efficient gait that suggested familiarity with the terrain. It wasn't stumbling or crashing through the underbrush like a frightened animal. Instead, it moved purposefully and quietly, like a predator that knew exactly where it was going. Zachary watched the area for another 20 minutes, but the creature didn't reappear. The forest seemed to have swallowed it completely, leaving no trace of its passage. Only Zachary's racing heart and the vivid memory of that brief sighting provided evidence that he had seen anything at all. The remainder of Thursday afternoon was spent at the line shack, reviewing his photographs and trying to decide on his next move. The rational part of his mind insisted that he was letting his imagination run wild, that the tracks and other evidence could be explained by known animals and natural phenomena. but the brief sighting of the upright figure had shaken that rationalization. Zachary considered packing up and heading home early. He had accomplished his original mission of reducing the hog population in the area, and he had collected interesting documentation of some unusual tracks. There was no shame in ending the hunting trip a day early, especially given the increasingly unsettling circumstances. But another part of his mind, the part that had made him a successful hunter and an effective mechanic, wanted answers. The evidence he had collected was too compelling to dismiss, and the brief sighting of the creature had provided confirmation that something extraordinary was indeed inhabiting these woods. The opportunity to document and possibly understand such a discovery was too significant to abandon without further investigation. As Thursday evening approached, Zachary made his decision. He would spend one more night at the line shack and make a final attempt to observe the creature on Friday morning. If he could get clear photographs or video of whatever was living in these woods, he would have evidence that could be shared with wildlife biologists or other experts who might be able to provide answers. The decision made, Zachary spent Thursday evening preparing for what he hoped would be a successful observation session. He checked his camera batteries, reviewed the best vantage points he had identified during his scouting, and planned his approach to the downstream area where he had seen the most sign. Thursday night brought with it sounds that Zachary had never heard before in decades of hunting and camping. Starting around midnight, a series of deep, resonant calls echoed through the forest. Unlike anything made by known wildlife in the area, the calls seemed to come from multiple directions, suggesting either several creatures or one creature that was moving rapidly through the forest. The vocalizations were difficult to describe or categorize. They weren't the howls of coyotes or wolves, nor the grunts and squeals of hogs. Instead, they sounded almost human, but with a tonal quality that was deeper and more powerful than any human voice. The calls seemed to carry for miles through the forest, creating an eerie harmony that raised the hair on the back of Zachary's neck. Between the vocalizations, Zachary heard other sounds that suggested large animals moving through the forest. Branches broke, leaves rustled, and occasionally there were heavy footfalls that seemed to shake the ground even inside the solid stone and timber construction of the line shack. Whatever was out there was not only large, but was making no attempt to move quietly. Around 3 a.m, something approached the line shack itself. Zachary, who had been lying in his sleeping bag listening to the forest sounds, heard heavy footsteps circling the building. The steps were deliberate and measured, as if something was examining the structure and its occupant. The footsteps stopped directly outside the main window of the line shack. For several long minutes, Zachary lay frozen in his sleeping bag, hardly daring to breathe, as something stood motionless just outside the building. He could hear what sounded like heavy breathing, deep and slow, and occasionally a sniffing sound, as if the creature was testing the air for scents. Zachary considered reaching for his rifle, which was leaning against the wall within arm's reach, but he was afraid that any movement would alert the creature to his exact location within the building. Instead, he lay perfectly still, listening to his own racing heartbeat and the sounds of the creature just outside. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 or 15 minutes, the footsteps resumed their circuit around the building. The creature made a complete circle around the line shack, stopping occasionally at doors and windows before finally moving away into the forest. The sounds of its departure were deliberate and unhurried, suggesting that it was leaving by choice rather than because it had been frightened away. Zachary didn't sleep again that night. He lay in his sleeping bag until dawn, listening to every sound in the forest and trying to process what had just occurred. The creature's approach to the line shack suggested not only intelligence, but also curiosity about human presence in the area. It had been investigating him as deliberately as he had been investigating it. Friday morning brought a crystal-clear dawn with perfect visibility and calm winds. Despite his sleepless night, Zachary felt alert and focused as he prepared for what he hoped would be a definitive encounter with whatever was living in these woods. He packed his camera with fresh batteries, loaded his rifle with a full magazine, and planned his approach to the downstream observation area. The plan was simple: reach the vicinity of the shelter site he had discovered the previous day, find a concealed position with good visibility, and wait for the creature to appear. Based on the previous night's activity, it seemed likely that the creature was active during daylight hours as well as at night. The approach to the observation area took longer than usual because Zachary moved with extreme caution, stopping frequently to listen and scan for any sign of the creature. The forest seemed unusually quiet, with fewer bird calls and small animal sounds than normal. The silence felt ominous, as if the usual inhabitants of the woods were avoiding the area for reasons they understood better than Zachary. About a quarter-mile from the shelter site, Zachary found an ideal observation position. A large fallen tree created a natural blind with excellent sight lines toward the creek bottom and the areas where he had found the most sign. The position also offered multiple escape routes if the situation became threatening. Zachary settled into the blind around 8:30 in the morning and began his wait. He had learned patience during years of deer hunting, and he was prepared to remain motionless for hours if necessary. The camera was ready with the telephoto lens attached, and his rifle was positioned for quick access if needed. The first hour passed without incident. Zachary used the time to study the terrain through his binoculars, identifying potential movement corridors and likely areas where the creature might appear. The creek bottom offered the most obvious travel route, but the thick forest provided numerous alternatives that could conceal a large animal's approach. Around 10 o'clock, Zachary noticed a change in the forest atmosphere. The few remaining bird calls stopped completely, and even the sound of wind in the trees seemed to diminish. The silence was so complete that Zachary could hear his own breathing and heartbeat. Something was approaching, and the other wildlife was reacting to its presence. The first sign of the creature was a barely perceptible movement in the thick brush about 200 yards downstream. Zachary caught the motion in his peripheral vision and slowly turned his binoculars toward the area. For several minutes he saw nothing definitive, just occasional movements that could have been wind in the leaves or small animals in the underbrush. Then, emerging from behind a stand of pine trees near the creek bank, Zachary saw the creature clearly for the first time. It was massive, standing at least 8 feet tall and covered in dark brown hair that seemed to blend perfectly with the forest environment. The creature moved upright on 2 legs with a fluid, confident gait that suggested perfect familiarity with the terrain. What struck Zachary most about the creature was its human-like characteristics combined with features that were clearly non-human. The head was proportionally large, with a pronounced brow ridge and a face that seemed to combine ape and human features. The arms were longer than human proportions would suggest, and the shoulders were massively broad and muscled. The creature moved toward the creek bank, apparently to drink, and Zachary had his first opportunity to observe its behavior in detail. It knelt at the water's edge in a distinctly human-like posture, cupping water in its hands and drinking. The movements were deliberate and intelligent, showing manual dexterity that was clearly advanced. Zachary managed to take several photographs of the creature drinking, though the distance and forest lighting made it difficult to get perfectly clear images. The camera's telephoto lens captured enough detail to show the creature's massive size and human-like behavior, but the shots would likely appear ambiguous to anyone who hadn't witnessed the scene directly. After drinking, the creature stood and began moving along the creek bank toward Zachary's position. As it came closer, more details became visible. The creature's face showed clear intelligence, with eyes that seemed to scan the forest constantly for threats or opportunities. Its movements were coordinated and purposeful, suggesting not just animal cunning, but genuine reasoning ability. When the creature reached the shelter site Zachary had discovered the previous day, it stopped and examined the area carefully. It seemed to notice that the site had been disturbed, checking the arranged branches and examining the ground around the makeshift fire ring. The creature's reaction suggested that it was aware of Zachary's previous visit and was assessing the level of human intrusion into its territory. For several minutes, the creature remained at the shelter site, occasionally looking in different directions as if listening for sounds or testing the air for scents. Zachary realized that it was probably aware of his presence in the general area, even if it hadn't pinpointed his exact location. The creature's senses were clearly far more acute than human capabilities. The standoff continued for nearly an hour, with the creature remaining near the shelter site and Zachary maintaining his position in the fallen tree blind. Neither seemed willing to make the first move that would escalate the encounter. Zachary continued to take photographs when possible, but he was careful not to make any sudden movements that might provoke a reaction. Around noon, the situation changed dramatically. Another creature appeared from the upstream direction, moving along the creek bank toward the shelter site. This second individual was even larger than the first, standing close to 9 feet tall with broader shoulders and a more pronounced muscular build. The two creatures greeted each other with vocalizations similar to what Zachary had heard during the night, deep, resonant calls that seemed to carry complex information. The appearance of a second creature forced Zachary to reconsider his situation. He was now observing not just one unknown animal, but at least two, and possibly more if others were in the area, but out of sight. The creatures were clearly intelligent and social, with communication abilities that suggested complex organization. Most concerning was the fact that both creatures seemed to be aware of Zachary's presence in the general area. They frequently looked in his direction, and their body language suggested alertness and caution rather than the relaxed behavior of animals that felt completely secure in their environment. The larger creature began to move in Zachary's direction, not directly, but in a pattern that would gradually close the distance between them. It moved from tree to tree, using the forest cover to mask its approach while maintaining visual contact with Zachary's approximate position. The behavior was clearly tactical, suggesting not just intelligence, but strategic thinking. Zachary realized that his position was becoming untenable. The creature was systematically eliminating his concealment while positioning itself for a closer approach. Whether the intent was curiosity, territoriality, or something more threatening, Zachary couldn't afford to wait and find out. He needed to extract himself from the situation before the creature could close the distance entirely. Moving as quietly as possible, Zachary began to back away from his observation position, using the fallen tree as concealment for his initial movements. The plan was to put distance between himself and the creatures, then circle back toward the line shack through areas where he would have better visibility and more room to maneuver. The withdrawal didn't go unnoticed. As soon as Zachary began to move, both creatures became more active and alert. The larger individual increased the pace of its approach, while the first creature began moving to flank Zachary's position from the other side. They were clearly coordinating their movements to cut off his escape routes. What had started as an observation session was rapidly evolving into something more dangerous. Zachary found himself being hunted by creatures that were not only physically imposing, but demonstrably intelligent and capable of tactical coordination. His years of hunting experience had never prepared him for being the prey in such an encounter. The forest that had been familiar and comfortable just hours earlier now seemed like alien territory. Every tree and bush could conceal an approaching creature, and every sound could signal an imminent confrontation. Zachary's heart rate increased as the reality of his situation became clear. He was being stalked by unknown predators in terrain where they held every advantage. Moving as quickly as stealth would allow, Zachary made his way toward higher ground where he would have better visibility and more options for movement. Behind him, he could hear the creatures adjusting their positions to maintain their pursuit. They moved with surprising quiet for animals of their size, but occasionally a breaking branch or rustling leaves revealed their locations. The pursuit continued for over a mile, with Zachary gradually working his way toward the line shack, while the creatures maintained pressure from multiple directions. They seemed content to keep him moving, rather than forcing an immediate confrontation, but their intent remained unclear and threatening. Around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the nature of the encounter changed again. Zachary had reached a small clearing about half a mile from the line shack when the larger creature stepped into the open less than 50 yards away. For the first time, human and creature faced each other with clear visibility and no barriers between them. The creature stood motionless, studying Zachary with eyes that showed unmistakable intelligence. Its face combined features that were recognizably human with others that were clearly not, creating an expression that was both familiar and deeply unsettling. The creature's size was overwhelming at close range, with shoulders that seemed twice as broad as any human and arms that hung nearly to its knees. For several long minutes, neither moved. Zachary stood frozen, with his rifle ready but not raised, uncertain whether the creature intended aggression or was simply curious about the human intruder in its territory. The creature's body language suggested alertness, but not immediate hostility, and Zachary was reluctant to escalate the situation by making any threatening gestures. The standoff was broken by the appearance of the second creature at the edge of the clearing. Now Zachary was facing two massive unknown animals with nowhere to retreat and limited options for defense. His rifle could probably stop one of them, but the second would have time to reach him before he could reload or acquire a new target. The larger creature began to move toward Zachary with slow, deliberate steps. Its approach was not the rush of an attacking predator, but the measured advance of something that was confident in its dominance of the situation. Zachary found himself backing away step by step, maintaining distance while trying to assess the creature's intentions. When the distance between them had closed to about 20 yards, the creature stopped and made a series of vocalizations that sounded like a complex attempt at communication. The sounds were unlike anything Zachary had heard before, combining elements that seemed almost linguistic with tones that conveyed clear emotional content. The creature was trying to communicate with him. Zachary attempted to respond, speaking in calm, low tones that he hoped would convey non-aggressive intentions. "Easy there, big fellow. I don't want any trouble. Just going to back away slowly and leave you alone." His voice sounded strange and weak in the forest setting, overwhelmed by the presence of the massive creatures. The response from the creature was immediate and startling. It tilted its head in a gesture that was unmistakably thoughtful, as if it was processing the sounds of human speech and trying to understand their meaning. Then it took another step forward and made additional vocalizations that seemed more insistent and urgent. Zachary realized that the creature was not trying to threaten him, but was attempting some form of communication or interaction. The posture and movement suggested curiosity rather than aggression, but the sheer size and power of the animal made any interaction potentially dangerous, regardless of intent. The moment of tentative communication was shattered by the unexpected appearance of a third creature emerging from the forest behind Zachary. This individual was smaller than the other two, but moved with aggressive body language that was clearly threatening. It vocalized sharply at the other creatures, and their demeanor changed immediately from curious to alert and defensive. Zachary found himself surrounded by three massive unknown creatures in a remote forest clearing with no immediate escape route. The situation had deteriorated from observation to pursuit to potential confrontation, and his options were rapidly diminishing. The smaller creature's aggressive behavior seemed to have triggered a pack response that was clearly dangerous. The larger creature that had been attempting communication stepped back and vocalized to the others in what sounded like complex interaction. The exchange among the three creatures suggested not just intelligence but sophisticated social organization with clear hierarchies and communication protocols. Then, without warning, the smaller, aggressive creature charged. The attack came with shocking speed for an animal of its size. One moment, it was standing at the edge of the clearing, and the next, it was covering the distance to Zachary in long, powerful strides. Zachary had barely enough time to raise his rifle before the creature was upon him. The impact knocked Zachary backward off his feet, sending his rifle flying into the underbrush. The creature's hands grasped his shoulders with incredible strength, and for a terrifying moment, Zachary thought he was about to be torn apart. The creature's face was inches from his own, showing massive teeth and eyes that burned with what seemed like intelligent fury. But instead of the killing blow that Zachary expected, the creature pushed him hard against the ground and held him there for several seconds, as if demonstrating its power and dominance. The grip on his shoulders was painful but not crushing, and the creature seemed to be exercising restraint rather than maximum force. Then, as suddenly as the attack had begun, it ended. The creature released Zachary and stepped back, vocalizing to the other two individuals who had remained at the edge of the clearing during the brief confrontation. The exchange among them seemed to involve some form of discussion or argument about how to handle the human intruder. Zachary lay on the ground for several moments, stunned by the speed and power of the attack, but gradually realizing that he was not seriously injured. The creature could easily have killed him, but had chosen instead to demonstrate its dominance and then withdraw. The message was clear. He was in their territory and subject to their decisions about his fate. Slowly, Zachary got to his feet and looked around for his rifle. The weapon was lying about 10 feet away, where it had landed when the creature knocked him down. The creatures watched as he retrieved the rifle, but they made no move to prevent him from rearming himself. Their confidence in their ability to handle any threat he might pose was evident. The larger creature that had initially attempted communication approached again, but this time its demeanor was different. The curiosity was still present, but it was now combined with what seemed like a warning. The creature gestured toward the forest edge and vocalized in tones that clearly indicated Zachary should leave the area. Understanding the message, Zachary began to back away toward the line shack, keeping his rifle ready but not pointing it at any of the creatures. They followed his movements but made no attempt to prevent his departure. The confrontation was over, and he was being allowed to leave with a clear warning not to return. The retreat to the line shack took nearly an hour, with Zachary moving carefully and constantly checking behind him for signs of pursuit. The creatures didn't follow him beyond the clearing, but he could occasionally hear their vocalizations in the distance, suggesting they were tracking his movements and communicating about his progress. When Zachary finally reached the line shack, his hands were shaking so badly that he had difficulty opening the door. The encounter had been the most terrifying experience of his life, but it had also been the most extraordinary. He had faced unknown creatures that displayed intelligence, social organization, and communication abilities that challenged everything he thought he knew about wildlife. Inside the line shack, Zachary checked himself for injuries and found only bruises on his shoulders where the creature had gripped him. Considering the power that had been displayed, he was remarkably unharmed. The creatures had clearly chosen to demonstrate their dominance without causing serious injury, a decision that suggested not just intelligence, but also restraint, and possibly even a form of morality. The photographs on his camera provided some documentation of the encounter, though the images were not as clear as he had hoped. The distance and forest lighting had made perfect shots difficult, and the pictures would likely appear ambiguous to anyone who hadn't witnessed the events directly. but combined with his detailed observations and measurements of tracks and sign, the evidence was compelling. As afternoon turned to evening, Zachary faced a crucial decision. He could pack up immediately and leave the area, ending his investigation and returning to the safety of civilization. Or he could remain for one more night and attempt to process what he had learned about these remarkable creatures. The rational choice was clearly to leave immediately. He had already pushed his luck far beyond reasonable limits, and the creatures had made it clear that his presence was not welcome in their territory. Continuing to remain in the area would be unnecessarily dangerous and potentially provocative, but the significance of what he had discovered was overwhelming. These creatures represented something unprecedented in modern wildlife science, possibly a surviving population of a species thought to be extinct or mythical. The implications for biology, anthropology, and human understanding of our place in the natural world were staggering. As darkness fell on Friday evening, Zachary made his decision. He would spend one more night at the line shack, but he would leave first thing Saturday morning. The night would give him time to organize his notes and photographs and to consider how to present his discoveries to people who might be able to provide answers or conduct further investigation. The night sounds that had seemed ominous on previous evenings now carried different meanings for Zachary. The deep calls echoing through the forest were no longer mysterious. They were the communications of an intelligent species that had allowed him to leave their territory unharmed. The breaking branches and heavy footfalls were evidence of creatures that possessed remarkable physical capabilities, but had chosen to use restraint rather than overwhelming force. Saturday morning brought a clear, cold dawn that seemed to mark the end of an extraordinary chapter in Zachary's life. He packed his gear methodically, double-checking to ensure he hadn't left any evidence of his stay that might attract unwanted attention to the area. The creatures had demonstrated remarkable tolerance for his intrusion, and he owed them the courtesy of leaving their territory undisturbed. The drive back to Marcus's ranch headquarters took place in contemplative silence. Zachary's mind was already working on the problem of how to explain what he had discovered and documented. The physical evidence was compelling, but not conclusive, and the most dramatic aspects of his encounter were based on personal observation that would be difficult to verify. Marcus was waiting at the ranch house when Zachary arrived, eager to hear about the success of the hunting trip. "How'd you do with those hogs, Zach?" "Find the ones that were tearing up my north pasture." Zachary managed to provide a brief summary of his hunting success without mentioning the more extraordinary aspects of his trip. He had indeed taken several hogs and had documented extensive sign of their activity in the area. The original mission had been accomplished, even though it had been overshadowed by discoveries that Marcus would find difficult to believe. "Appreciate you taking care of that problem," Marcus said, as they loaded Zachary's gear into his truck. "You're welcome to come back any time if they start giving me trouble again. That area's been pretty active lately with all kinds of wildlife movement." The comment about wildlife movement caught Zachary's attention, but he decided not to pursue the topic. Marcus was clearly unaware of the extraordinary creatures that were living in the remote sections of his property, and Zachary wasn't ready to be the one to inform him. The drive home to his own place gave Zachary time to consider his next steps. The evidence he had collected was significant but incomplete. The photographs were suggestive but not definitive. His personal observations were detailed and credible, but based solely on his own testimony. To be taken seriously by scientific or wildlife management communities, he would need more substantive proof. But Zachary also recognized the potential dangers of pursuing the matter further. The creatures had demonstrated remarkable intelligence and social organization, and they had clearly chosen to allow him to leave their territory unharmed. Bringing additional people into the area might provoke a very different response, with consequences that could be dangerous for both humans and creatures. The question of whether to share his discoveries with others would dominate Zachary's thoughts for the weeks and months that followed. The implications of what he had witnessed were too significant to keep entirely secret, but the responsibility of revealing the existence of such creatures was also too great to handle carelessly. When Sarah and Emma returned from Tulsa the following Tuesday, Zachary found himself struggling with how much to tell them about his hunting trip. Sarah was accustomed to hearing detailed accounts of his outdoor adventures, but this experience was different in ways that would be difficult to explain without sounding delusional or deceptive. "How was your trip to Marcus's place?" Sarah asked over dinner that evening. "Did you get the hog problem taken care of?" Zachary provided a carefully edited version of events that focused on the successful hunting aspects while omitting any mention of the extraordinary encounters. "Got several good shots and documented a lot of sign in the area. Looks like the population is pretty well established, but I put a good dent in it." Emma was more interested in whether her father had seen any other interesting wildlife during his trip. "Did you see any deer, Daddy? Or maybe a bear?" The question about bears came uncomfortably close to the truth, and Zachary found himself wondering how to answer honestly without revealing more than he was ready to discuss. "Saw some interesting tracks and signs, sweetheart. The woods are full of animals that most people never get to see." That evening, after Sarah and Emma had gone to bed, Zachary sat in his workshop reviewing the photographs and notes from his trip. The evidence was compelling to him because he had witnessed the events directly, but he tried to evaluate it objectively as others might see it. The photographs were intriguing, but not conclusive. The track measurements were interesting, but could be explained by known animals or hoaxes. His personal observations were detailed and consistent, but ultimately unverifiable. Over the following weeks, Zachary found himself researching similar encounters reported by other hunters and outdoorsmen. The internet provided access to hundreds of accounts of Sasquatch or Bigfoot sightings, but the quality of evidence and credibility of witnesses varied dramatically. Many reports were obviously fabricated or based on misidentification of known animals. Others were more compelling, but still lacked the kind of documentation that would satisfy scientific scrutiny. The more Zachary studied existing reports, the more he appreciated the significance of his own encounter. Very few witnesses had been able to observe the creatures for extended periods or document their behavior in detail. His photographs, while not perfect, showed more clear detail than most existing evidence. His observations of social interaction and communication among multiple creatures were particularly rare in the literature. But Zachary also began to understand the challenges faced by anyone who attempted to report such encounters. The scientific community generally dismissed such reports as misidentification, hoaxes, or psychological phenomena. Wildlife management agencies had no protocols for dealing with reports of unknown species. The media typically treated such stories as entertainment rather than serious investigation. Most concerning was the potential impact on the creatures themselves. If their existence became widely known, their remote habitat would likely be invaded by researchers, tourists, and hunters. The intelligence and social organization that Zachary had observed suggested that such intrusion would be deeply disruptive to creatures that had clearly adapted to avoiding human contact. 3 weeks after his return from the hunting trip, Zachary made a decision that would affect the rest of his life. He would not immediately publicize his discoveries, but he would continue to investigate the matter privately. If he could gather additional evidence or make contact with other credible witnesses, he might eventually be able to present a case that would be taken seriously by the scientific community. The decision required Zachary to develop skills and knowledge that went far beyond his experience as a hunter and mechanic. He began studying wildlife biology, anthropology, and primatology to better understand the implications of what he had observed. He learned about scientific protocols for documenting and reporting new species discoveries. He researched the legal and ethical issues surrounding contact with potentially endangered species. Most importantly, Zachary began to develop a network of contacts with other people who had reported similar encounters. Through online forums and hunting communities, he found other witnesses whose accounts were credible and detailed. Many of these people had remained silent about their experiences for the same reasons that Zachary was considering keeping his discoveries private. The process of connecting with other witnesses gradually revealed the existence of a hidden community of people who had encountered these creatures, but had chosen not to make their experiences public. The reasons for secrecy were consistent: fear of ridicule, concern for the creature's welfare, and recognition that public attention would likely destroy the remote habitats where such encounters occurred. Over the course of the winter following his hunting trip, Zachary developed relationships with several other witnesses whose accounts corroborated many aspects of his own experience. The creatures appeared to inhabit remote forest areas across multiple states, with populations that were small but stable. They demonstrated consistent patterns of intelligence, social organization, and avoidance of human contact. Most significantly, multiple witnesses reported that the creatures seemed to exercise restraint in their interactions with humans. Even when encounters became confrontational, as Zachary's experience had, the creatures typically chose to demonstrate their power rather than use it destructively. This pattern suggested not just intelligence, but also a form of ethics or morality that was remarkable in any species. As spring arrived and hunting season approached again, Zachary faced another decision about whether to return to Marcus's property. The area where he had made his discoveries continued to show signs of hog activity, providing a legitimate reason for another hunting trip. But returning to the creature's territory would risk another encounter that might not end as fortunately as his first experience. After considerable deliberation, Zachary decided to make one more trip to the area, but with a different purpose. Instead of attempting to observe or document the creatures, he would focus on understanding their habitat needs and ensuring that their territory remained undisturbed. If he could help protect their environment without directly interfering with their lives, he might be able to contribute to their long-term survival. The second trip to Marcus's ranch took place in late October, almost exactly 1 year after Zachary's original encounter. This time, he brought different equipment: trail cameras, soil testing kits, and botanical guides instead of hunting gear. His mission was to study the ecosystem that supported the creatures rather than the creatures themselves. The changes in the area were immediately apparent. The shelter site where Zachary had first observed the creatures showed signs of continued use, but with modifications that suggested learning and adaptation. The crude lean-to had been improved with additional materials and better construction techniques. The fire ring had been expanded and showed evidence of recent use. Most significantly, Zachary discovered multiple shelter sites scattered throughout the creature's territory, suggesting either a larger population or more sophisticated use of the available habitat. The sites were all carefully concealed and showed evidence of long-term occupation rather than temporary use. Trail cameras placed at strategic locations provided additional insights into the creature's behavior and population. Over the course of a week, The cameras documented multiple individuals of different sizes, confirming that Zachary had encountered a family group or small community rather than just isolated individuals. The footage also showed behaviors that Zachary hadn't observed during his direct encounters. The creatures demonstrated tool use, food processing, and care of young that indicated a complex social structure. They showed clear awareness of the trail cameras, but seemed to treat them as curiosities rather than threats, occasionally approaching the devices to examine them closely. Most remarkably, one sequence of footage showed an adult creature deliberately triggering a trail camera and then positioning a young individual in front of the lens, as if deliberately providing documentation of their species. The behavior suggested not just intelligence, but also an understanding that humans were documenting their existence and possibly a decision to cooperate with such efforts. The week-long research trip provided Zachary with more comprehensive documentation of the creatures than any previous investigator had achieved. The trail camera footage, combined with detailed habitat studies and behavioral observations, created a substantial body of evidence that could support serious scientific investigation. But the week also reinforced Zachary's concerns about the potential impact of publicity on the creatures. Their habitat was fragile and could easily be disrupted by increased human activity. Their behavior suggested that they had adapted to minimal contact with humans and might not be able to cope with more intensive interaction. When Zachary returned home from his research trip, he was carrying evidence that could change scientific understanding of primate evolution and human origins. But he was also carrying the responsibility of protecting a species that had survived by remaining hidden and might not survive discovery. The decision about what to do with his evidence would consume Zachary's thoughts for months. He consulted with wildlife biologists, anthropologists, and conservation experts, always carefully avoiding specific details about location or evidence that might compromise the creature's security. The advice he received was consistent. Any announcement of such a discovery would need to be accompanied by comprehensive protection measures for the species and their habitat. Over the course of the next year, Zachary began to work quietly with conservation organizations and government agencies to establish protective measures for the area where the creatures lived. Using his evidence carefully and selectively, he was able to convince key officials that significant wildlife resources in the region needed protection without specifically revealing the nature of those resources. The process was slow and frustrating, requiring Zachary to navigate complex bureaucratic and political challenges while maintaining secrecy about the most compelling aspects of his case. But gradually, protective measures began to be implemented. Land use restrictions were established, access roads were closed, and monitoring programs were put in place. 2 years after his initial encounter, Zachary felt confident enough in the protective measures to begin sharing his evidence with a carefully selected group of researchers. Working with a small team of scientists who understood the sensitivity of the situation, he was able to initiate formal study of the creatures without compromising their security. The research that followed would eventually revolutionize understanding of human evolution and the survival of archaic species, but it was conducted with unprecedented care to protect the welfare of the study subjects and preserve their natural habitat. Zachary's insistence on protective measures before revelation became a model for ethical research with endangered species. The creatures themselves seemed to adapt to the carefully managed research presence, eventually allowing direct observation and even limited interaction with approved researchers. Their intelligence and social complexity exceeded even Zachary's initial assessments, leading to discoveries about cognition and culture that challenged fundamental assumptions about the uniqueness of human capabilities. But for Zachary, the most important outcome of his discovery was the knowledge that he had helped protect a remarkable species from extinction. The creatures that had once faced potential destruction through habitat loss and human interference now had a secure future thanks to the conservation measures that had been implemented. The 8-year-old daughter, who had asked about bears during his first hunting trip, was now in high school, and Zachary finally felt ready to share the full story of his discoveries with his family. Emma's reaction to learning about her father's encounters was a mixture of amazement and pride that perfectly captured the significance of what had been accomplished. "Dad, you saved an entire species," she said, after reviewing the photographs and research documentation that Zachary had accumulated over the years. "How many people ever get to do something that important?" The question reminded Zachary that his hunting trip to Marcus's ranch had been far more than just a successful elimination of problem hogs. It had been the beginning of a conservation success story that would protect one of the most remarkable species on Earth for future generations to study and appreciate. As Zachary reflected on the events that had begun with a simple hunting trip and evolved into a major scientific discovery, he realized that the most important decision he had made was to prioritize the welfare of the creatures over his own desire for recognition. By choosing protection over publicity, he had ensured that future researchers would have the opportunity to learn from these remarkable beings, rather than simply reading about them in historical accounts. The creatures that had once pushed him to the ground in a remote Oklahoma forest were now the subjects of the most carefully managed research program in the history of primatology. Their intelligence, culture, and survival strategies were providing insights that would benefit not just science, but also conservation efforts for other endangered species around the world. And in the quiet moments when Zachary returned to hunt in the carefully protected forests where it all began, he sometimes caught glimpses of the creatures that had trusted him with their existence. They no longer fled from human presence, but had learned to coexist with the researchers who studied them with respect and care. The story that had begun with tracks in the mud beside Bitter Creek had become a testament to the power of ethical decision-making and the possibility of positive outcomes when humans choose to protect rather than exploit the natural world. For Zachary, it remained the most important hunt of his life, not for what he had taken from the forest, but for what he had helped preserve for the future. The next case, Tyler Brooks had been hunting these mountains for 37 years, ever since his father first brought him up to the Gallatin Range when he was 12 years old. Now, at 49, with silver threading through his dark beard and laugh lines etched deep around his green eyes, he considered himself one of the most experienced hunters in southwestern Montana. His basement workshop was filled with trophies: elk, deer, black bear, and even a mountain lion that had taken him 3 seasons to track down. But more than the kills, Tyler prided himself on his knowledge of the wilderness, his ability to read sign that most hunters would walk right past, and his almost supernatural sense for when something wasn't quite right in the woods. That knowledge had kept him alive through countless hunting seasons, through sudden blizzards that had claimed less experienced outdoorsmen, through encounters with grizzlies that could have ended badly, and through terrain that had broken ankles and spirits of men half his age. Tyler's reputation in the hunting community around Bozeman was solid. Guides sought his advice, sporting goods stores recommended his services to out-of-state clients, and the Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks Department had consulted him on several occasions when tracking problem animals. He was methodical in everything he did, from his pre-season scouting trips to his meticulous gear preparation. Tyler owned a small construction company that did well enough to afford him quality equipment, and he spared no expense when it came to his hunting gear. His Matthews bow had been custom-tuned by the best archery shop in the state. His broadheads were razor-sharp and field-tested, and his clothing was all high-end technical gear designed for the harsh Montana wilderness. He studied weather patterns, migration routes, and feeding habits with the dedication of a scientist. Other hunters might rely on luck or persistence, but Tyler believed in preparation and knowledge. The elk season of 2023 had started like any other. Tyler had spent the previous spring and summer scouting the area around Hyalite Peak, a region he'd hunted successfully for over 2 decades. The area was remote enough to discourage casual hunters, but accessible enough that experienced outdoorsmen could navigate it safely. He'd found fresh elk sign in August, rubs on aspen trees, wallows in muddy clearings, and trails worn deep by years of migration. The herd was healthy and stable, moving in predictable patterns between their feeding areas and bedding sites. Tyler's hunting partner for this season was Marcus Chen, a trauma surgeon from Billings who had moved to Montana 5 years earlier from California. Marcus was relatively new to hunting, but possessed the same methodical mindset that made him excellent in the operating room. Tyler had been teaching him the finer points of elk hunting for 3 seasons now, and Marcus had developed into a competent and ethical hunter. More importantly, he was reliable in the wilderness, careful with safety protocols, and possessed an almost endless capacity for the patience that elk hunting required. They had planned a 5-day backcountry hunt, hiking into a remote basin that Tyler had discovered years earlier. The area was a natural funnel for elk moving between summer and winter ranges, and Tyler had taken several bulls there over the years. It required a 4-mile hike from the nearest Forest Service road, climbing through dense timber and crossing 2 creek beds before reaching the small meadow where they planned to establish their base camp. On September 15th, they loaded Tyler's truck with their gear and made the pre-dawn drive up the Forest Service road. The aspens were just beginning to turn gold, and the morning air carried the crisp promise of the coming winter. Marcus was unusually quiet during the drive, nervous about his first extended backcountry hunt. Tyler reassured him with stories from previous hunts, describing the peace that came from being completely disconnected from civilization, the satisfaction of harvesting meat through skill and patience rather than simply purchasing it from a store. The hike into their hunting area took nearly 3 hours, both men carrying heavy packs loaded with 5 days' worth of gear and food. Tyler moved with the steady rhythm of someone who had made similar hikes hundreds of times, while Marcus struggled initially with the altitude and the weight of his pack. But by the time they reached the meadow where they would camp, both men were warmed up and moving well. The campsite was perfect. A small clearing near a reliable water source, protected from wind by a stand of mature Douglas fir trees and positioned to provide easy access to multiple hunting areas. Tyler had camped in this exact spot many times before, and he moved with practiced efficiency as he set up their shelter and organized their gear. They used a 4-season tent designed for mountain conditions, knowing that September weather in the Montana Rockies could change from pleasant to deadly within hours. Their first afternoon was spent glassing the surrounding meadows and timber edges, looking for elk sign and trying to pattern any animals in the area. They found fresh tracks in the soft soil near the creek, rubs on several trees that showed recent activity, and droppings that were no more than a day old. Everything indicated that elk were using the area regularly, confirming Tyler's pre-season scouting reports. That evening, as they prepared dinner over a small camp stove, Tyler shared some of the history of the area. The basin had been used by Native American hunting parties for centuries before white settlers arrived. Arrowheads and other artifacts had been found throughout the region, evidence of the rich game populations that had sustained human hunters for generations. The area had also seen its share of more recent history: gold prospectors in the late 1800s, logging operations in the early 1900s, and the inevitable conflict between development and conservation that had shaped much of Montana's wilderness. Marcus asked about predators in the area, a reasonable concern for anyone camping in grizzly bear country. Tyler explained their safety protocols, proper food storage, maintaining clean campsites, making noise while hiking, and carrying bear spray. He'd encountered black bears numerous times over the years and had seen grizzly sign on several occasions, but he'd never had a dangerous encounter. The key was respect, respecting the animal's space and following established safety procedures. Their first full day of hunting began before dawn. Tyler believed in hunting the edges, the transition zones between feeding and bedding areas where elk moved during low-light periods. They split up to cover more ground, maintaining radio contact and following predetermined routes through areas Tyler had identified during his scouting trips. The morning was crisp and clear, with just enough breeze to keep their scent from traveling too far. Tyler worked his way slowly through a series of small meadows connected by game trails worn deep into the forest floor. He moved with the patience that only comes from decades of experience, pausing frequently to listen and glass potential bedding areas. The forest was alive with the sounds of early morning, chattering squirrels, the distant call of ravens, and the occasional crack of a branch as deer moved through the timber. Around 10:30, Tyler found fresh elk sign that made his pulse quicken. A large bull had rubbed an aspen tree sometime during the night, leaving long strips of bark scattered on the ground, and the characteristic musky scent that comes from the glands on an elk's face. The rub was at least 6 feet off the ground, indicating a mature animal with substantial antlers. Tyler examined the sign carefully, noting the direction the elk had been traveling and the freshness of the rub. He followed the elk's trail through the timber, moving slowly and carefully to avoid making noise. The trail led uphill toward a series of small ridges that provided excellent vantage points over the surrounding valley. Tyler's experience told him this was likely a bedding area, somewhere the elk could rest during the day while maintaining visual and scent contact with their surroundings. After 2 hours of careful stalking, Tyler finally spotted the bull. It was a magnificent animal, a mature 6-point bull with heavy antlers and the thick neck that comes from the rutting season. The elk was bedded in a small clearing approximately 80 yards away, positioned perfectly for a bow shot if Tyler could close the distance without being detected. Tyler spent 45 minutes working into position, moving inch by inch through the timber. Every step was calculated, every movement deliberate. He used the natural sounds of the forest to mask his approach, timing his movements with wind gusts that would cover any noise he might make. The bull remained bedded, occasionally lifting his head to scan for danger, but showing no signs of alarm. When Tyler was finally within shooting range, he slowly drew his bow and settled the sight pin behind the elk's front shoulder. The shot would be slightly uphill, an angle he'd practiced countless times on the archery range. His breathing was controlled, his form was perfect, and the elk remained unaware of his presence. But as Tyler began to squeeze through the shot sequence, the bull suddenly stood and moved out of the clearing, disappearing into the timber without offering another shot opportunity. Tyler wasn't disappointed. This was elk hunting, and opportunities like this one were the reason he spent weeks in preparation and days in the wilderness. He'd had a perfect setup on a mature bull, and while the shot hadn't materialized, the encounter confirmed that his scouting had been accurate and that elk were indeed using this area regularly. He radioed Marcus to report the sighting and agreed to meet back at camp for lunch. The afternoon would be spent resting and preparing for the evening hunt, when elk activity would pick up again as the animals moved toward their feeding areas. Marcus had also seen sign during his morning hunt, fresh tracks and droppings that indicated elk were moving through his assigned area as well. They spent the lunch break comparing notes and planning their afternoon strategy. Tyler would return to the area where he'd encountered the bull, while Marcus would work a different drainage that showed promise based on the sign they'd found. The afternoon hunt was less eventful. Tyler saw several does and a small buck deer, but no elk. The wind had picked up considerably, making scent control more difficult and reducing the likelihood of getting close to any animals. By evening, both hunters were back in camp preparing dinner and sharing the day's experiences. That evening, as they sat around their small camp stove, Tyler noticed that the forest seemed unusually quiet. The normal evening sounds, birds settling in for the night, small mammals moving through the underbrush, the distant howl of coyotes, were notably absent. Tyler mentioned this to Marcus, who dismissed it as his inexperience making him imagine things. But Tyler's instincts were rarely wrong, and the silence bothered him more than he wanted to admit. Their second day followed a similar pattern. Tyler worked the same general area where he'd encountered the bull, hoping to pattern the animal's movement and potentially set up an ambush along one of the major trails. Marcus hunted a different section of their area, focusing on a series of small parks that looked like ideal feeding areas for elk. Around midday, Tyler made a discovery that would change everything. While following what appeared to be an elk trail through dense timber, he came across a tree that had been marked in a way he'd never seen before. A large Douglas fir, easily 4 feet in diameter, showed claw marks that extended from about 3 feet off the ground to nearly 8 feet high. The marks were deep, cutting through the bark and into the wood beneath, and they were clearly fresh. Sap was still seeping from the wounds. Tyler's first thought was bear, but the pattern was all wrong. Bear claw marks typically run vertically up a tree, made by animals climbing or marking territory. These marks were different, longer, more deliberately placed, and positioned higher than any black bear could reach. Even a large grizzly would struggle to reach the topmost marks, and Tyler had never seen a grizzly leave claw marks in such a precise pattern. He photographed the tree from multiple angles, using his smartphone to document what he was seeing. The marks appeared to have been made by something with enormous claws, something strong enough to tear through thick bark as if it were paper. Tyler measured the spacing between individual claw marks using his hunting knife as a reference. They were spaced wider than his hand could span. The discovery bothered Tyler more than he wanted to admit. In nearly 4 decades of hunting and hiking in Montana wilderness, he'd seen thousands of trees marked by bears, elk, deer, and other wildlife. This was different, and his inability to explain what had made the marks left him feeling unsettled in a way that was completely foreign to his usual confidence in the wilderness. When he radioed Marcus to describe the find, the surgeon's scientific mind immediately went to work, trying to provide rational explanations. Perhaps it was a bear with unusually long claws, or maybe the marks had been made over multiple visits by the same animal. Marcus suggested they examine the tree together after their evening hunt, approaching the mystery with the same methodical analysis they brought to hunting. But Tyler's unease continued to grow throughout the afternoon. The forest remained unusually quiet, and he found himself constantly looking over his shoulder, feeling as though he was being watched. His normally acute hunting instincts were telling him that something was wrong, that there was a presence in the woods that didn't belong. He'd felt similar sensations when being stalked by mountain lions or when moving through prime grizzly habitat, but this was different, more intense, and more personal. That evening, both hunters returned to the marked tree. In the fading light, the claw marks looked even more ominous, and Marcus had to admit that he couldn't provide a satisfactory explanation for what they were seeing. The marks were too high, too systematic, and too fresh to be attributed to any known animal in the area. As they examined the tree more carefully, Tyler found additional evidence that increased his concern. Around the base of the tree, the ground showed signs of significant disturbance. Large depressions in the soft forest floor suggested something heavy had stood at the base of the tree, something that had left footprints unlike anything Tyler had ever seen. The tracks were elongated and roughly humanoid in shape, but much larger than any human foot. Tyler estimated them at 18 inches long and nearly 8 inches wide at the broadest point. They showed clear toe impressions, with what appeared to be claw marks at the tips. The stride length between prints was enormous, easily 5 feet from step to step, suggesting a creature with legs much longer than any human. Tyler photographed the tracks as well, though the soft forest floor and fading light made it difficult to capture clear details. He also made rough measurements using his hunting knife and noted the depth of the impressions, which suggested something much heavier than a human had made them. Marcus approached the discovery with scientific skepticism, suggesting various explanations that might account for what they were seeing. Perhaps the tracks had been made by a person wearing some kind of modified footwear, or maybe they were looking at overlapping tracks from multiple animals. But even as he proposed these theories, Marcus had to admit they didn't adequately explain the size and depth of the impressions. That night, back at their campsite, both men found sleep difficult. Tyler lay in his sleeping bag, listening to every sound in the forest, his hunter's instincts on high alert. The normal night sounds, owls, small mammals moving through the underbrush, the distant howl of coyotes, remained absent. The silence was so complete it was almost oppressive, broken only by the gentle sound of wind through the trees and the occasional crack of settling wood in their campfire. Around 2 in the morning, Tyler was jolted awake by a sound unlike anything he'd ever heard in the wilderness. It was a vocalization that seemed to combine elements of a howl, a scream, and something almost human. The sound came from somewhere in the timber above their camp, perhaps a quarter-mile away, and it echoed through the basin with a volume and intensity that made Tyler's skin crawl. Marcus was awake instantly, sitting up in his sleeping bag with eyes wide. Both men lay perfectly still, listening for any additional sounds. The vocalization came again, this time from a different direction, as if whatever had made it was moving through the forest. The sound was answered by another call from across the valley, suggesting multiple animals communicating with each other. Tyler had heard elk bugle, wolves howl, bears vocalize, and mountain lions scream. This was none of those things. The calls had a quality that was almost linguistic, as if actual communication was taking place rather than simple territorial marking or mating calls. The vocalizations continued sporadically for nearly an hour before gradually fading away, leaving the forest in the same oppressive silence that had characterized the previous evening. Neither man slept well for the remainder of the night. Tyler found himself constantly listening for approaching footsteps or the sound of something moving through their camp. His rational mind told him they were perfectly safe in their tent, but his instincts were screaming that they were in the presence of something dangerous and unknown. Morning brought little relief from the tension that had built during the night. Both hunters were exhausted from poor sleep, and the strange events of the previous day had cast a shadow over what should have been an enjoyable hunting trip. Tyler suggested they spend the morning hunting closer to camp, staying within radio range and avoiding the area where they'd found the marked tree and unusual tracks. But as they prepared breakfast, Tyler noticed something that made his blood run cold. Around their campsite, in the soft soil near the creek, were more of the strange tracks they'd found the previous evening. The prints circled their camp at a distance of about 50 yards, as if something had spent time during the night observing them from the tree line. The tracks were clear enough in the morning light to show remarkable detail. Tyler could see individual toe impressions, what appeared to be a heel, and even what looked like texture from skin or fur. The prints were definitely fresh, made sometime during the night while they slept. The creature had moved around their campsite in a rough circle, pausing in several locations, as if studying their setup from different angles. Marcus examined the tracks with the same analytical approach he brought to medical diagnoses, but even his scientific skepticism was being challenged by the accumulating evidence. The tracks were too detailed to be hoaxes, too large to be made by any known animal, and too systematic to be random natural formations. Tyler's 37 years of wilderness experience were telling him they needed to leave the area immediately. Every instinct he'd developed over decades of hunting was screaming that they were in danger, that they were being stalked by something that viewed them as potential prey rather than predators to be avoided. But his logical mind argued against abandoning a hunt they'd planned for months, based on strange tracks and unusual sounds. The debate was settled when they discovered that something had been at their food storage during the night. Tyler always suspended food in bear-proof containers hung between trees, a standard precaution in grizzly country. But when they checked their cache that morning, the rope had been cut, not chewed through by a small animal, but cleanly severed as if by a knife or claw. The containers themselves were undamaged, but they had been removed from the trees and placed carefully on the ground. Nothing was missing, but the contents had clearly been examined. Packages of food had been opened and resealed, as if something with hands had carefully investigated their supplies before deciding not to take anything. This discovery pushed Tyler past his comfort zone. In all his years of wilderness camping, he'd never had an encounter that suggested such obvious intelligence and deliberate behavior. Bears might tear apart food containers, but they wouldn't carefully examine contents and reseal packages. Humans might have the intelligence to behave this way, but the tracks around their camp clearly hadn't been made by people. Marcus suggested they report their findings to the Forest Service when they returned to town, but Tyler was concerned about how such a report would be received. His reputation in the hunting community was built on reliability and sound judgment. Reporting encounters with unknown creatures making impossible tracks would likely be met with skepticism at best and ridicule at worst. They spent the morning packing their gear and preparing to leave the area. Tyler's instincts were telling him they needed to get out immediately, but Marcus wanted to hunt for at least part of the day before heading home. They compromised on hunting the morning in the immediate vicinity of their camp before packing out in the afternoon. Around 10 o'clock, while Tyler was working through a small meadow about a quarter-mile from camp, he had his first direct visual encounter with whatever had been tracking them. He was moving slowly through timber along the edge of the meadow when movement in his peripheral vision caught his attention. Something large was moving through the trees parallel to his position, keeping pace with him as he worked toward a small ridge. Tyler stopped and carefully studied the tree line, using his binoculars to scan for whatever had caught his attention. For several minutes he saw nothing, but then movement in a small clearing revealed what he was looking for. Standing in partial cover approximately 200 yards away was something that defied everything Tyler thought he knew about wildlife in Montana. The creature was enormous. Tyler estimated at least 8 feet tall and proportionally much broader than any human. It was covered in dark hair or fur that appeared reddish-brown in the morning sunlight. The build was generally humanoid, but much more heavily muscled, with shoulders that seemed impossibly wide and arms that hung down past where knees would be on a person. But what struck Tyler most was the obvious intelligence in the creature's behavior. It wasn't simply moving through the forest like a deer or elk following feeding patterns. It was clearly observing Tyler, studying his movements and maintaining position to keep him in sight while remaining partially concealed. When Tyler moved, the creature moved. When Tyler stopped, the creature stopped. Tyler watched through his binoculars for nearly 15 minutes, trying to convince himself he was looking at a bear standing on its hind legs or some other explainable wildlife encounter. But the creature's movements were too fluid, too purposeful, and too obviously intelligent to be attributed to any known animal. Finally, the creature seemed to realize it was being observed. It turned to face Tyler directly, and even at 200 yards, Tyler could see facial features that were distinctly primate-like, but much larger and more pronounced than any ape he'd seen in zoos or documentaries. The face was dark, with deep-set eyes that seemed to be studying him with the same intensity he was using to study it. The staring contest lasted perhaps 30 seconds before the creature simply melted back into the timber, moving with surprising grace for something so large. Tyler tried to follow its movement through his binoculars, but within moments it had completely disappeared into the forest, as if it had never been there at all. Tyler immediately radioed Marcus to report the sighting, but found himself struggling to describe what he'd seen. The words seemed inadequate to convey the reality of encountering something that shouldn't exist, something that challenged every assumption about wildlife in North America. Marcus was skeptical, but agreed to meet at camp immediately to discuss their next move. When Marcus arrived at camp 20 minutes later, he found Tyler sitting on a log, staring into the forest with an expression Marcus had never seen before. Tyler had always been the confident outdoorsman, the experienced hunter who seemed completely at ease in the wilderness. Now he looked shaken, uncertain, and eager to leave an environment that had been his refuge for decades. Tyler described his encounter in detail, trying to be as objective and factual as possible. He described the creature's size, its movements, its obvious intelligence, and the way it had seemed to be deliberately observing him. Marcus listened without interruption, applying his scientific training to evaluate what Tyler was reporting. From a medical perspective, Marcus had to consider the possibility that Tyler was experiencing some kind of altitude-related hallucination or stress-induced psychological episode. But Tyler showed no other signs of mental distress, and the physical evidence they'd found over the previous 2 days suggested that something unusual was indeed present in the area. They decided to pack immediately and leave the hunting area. Tyler's instincts were screaming that they were in danger, and even Marcus's scientific skepticism was being overwhelmed by the accumulating evidence of something that shouldn't exist. They broke camp quickly, stuffing gear into packs without the usual care they took to organize their equipment. As they prepared to leave, Tyler noticed that the forest had become even quieter than before. The oppressive silence that had characterized the previous day seemed to have intensified, as if every animal in the area had fled or gone into hiding. Even insects seemed absent, creating an unnatural quiet that made every sound of their packing seem amplified. They began the hike out around noon, moving faster than they normally would, with heavy packs. Tyler led the way, following the same route they'd used to hike in 3 days earlier. But within the first mile, Tyler realized they were being followed. He could hear movement in the timber, paralleling their trail, staying just out of sight but clearly keeping pace with their progress. Tyler stopped several times to listen and look for whatever was following them, but he never saw anything. The sounds would stop when they stopped, resume when they resumed hiking. It was obvious that something was deliberately tracking them, matching their pace and direction, while remaining concealed in the dense timber. Marcus began to hear the sounds as well, though his inexperience in the wilderness made it difficult for him to interpret what they meant. Tyler explained that whatever was following them was showing intelligence and purpose that went far beyond normal animal behavior. Predators might follow potential prey, but they typically did so with the intent of attacking when conditions were favorable. This felt different, more like being escorted out of territory by something that wanted them gone, but didn't necessarily want to harm them. Around 2 o'clock, while crossing a small creek about halfway to their vehicle, Tyler had his second direct encounter with the creature. He was helping Marcus navigate a particularly tricky crossing when movement upstream caught his attention. Standing at the edge of the creek, perhaps 60 yards away, was the same creature he'd observed that morning. This time, Tyler got a much clearer look at what they were dealing with. The creature was even larger than he'd estimated earlier, probably 9 feet tall and massively built through the chest and shoulders. Its arms were disproportionately long, hanging down past its knees, and ended in hands that were clearly visible even at 60 yards. The face was distinctly primate-like, but much more pronounced than any ape, with a prominent brow ridge and a mouth that seemed too large for human proportions. But again, what struck Tyler most was the obvious intelligence in the creature's behavior. It wasn't displaying aggression or territorial behavior like a bear or mountain lion might. Instead, it seemed to be observing them, studying their movements, and perhaps ensuring they were indeed leaving the area. Marcus saw the creature as well this time, and his scientific skepticism evaporated instantly when confronted with visual evidence of something that shouldn't exist. Both men stood frozen in the creek, staring at a creature that challenged everything they thought they knew about wildlife in North America. The encounter lasted perhaps 2 minutes before the creature simply turned and walked away, disappearing into the timber with movements that seemed impossibly fluid for something so large. Tyler and Marcus completed their creek crossing in silence, both men processing what they'd seen and trying to make sense of an encounter that defied rational explanation. The remainder of their hike out passed without incident, though Tyler continued to sense movement in the timber around them. Whatever had been following them seemed to be maintaining surveillance, but no longer felt the need to show itself. Tyler interpreted this as confirmation that they were being escorted out of territory, encouraged to leave by something that viewed their presence as unwelcome, but not necessarily threatening. They reached Tyler's truck around 5 o'clock. Both men exhausted from the physical exertion of hiking with heavy packs and the psychological stress of their encounters. Tyler had never been so relieved to see his vehicle, and he found himself checking the surrounding tree line for movement as they loaded their gear. The drive back to town was mostly silent, both men lost in their own thoughts about what they'd experienced. Tyler found himself questioning his own sanity, wondering if 37 years of wilderness experience had somehow led him to misinterpret perfectly normal events. But the tracks, the vocalizations, the disturbed food cache, and especially the 2 visual encounters were too vivid and too consistent to be dismissed as imagination or misidentification. Marcus approached the experience from his medical background, trying to find rational explanations for what they'd seen. He considered the possibility of hoaxes, unknown wildlife species, or even psychological episodes brought on by wilderness stress. But his scientific training also forced him to acknowledge that they'd observed something that couldn't be easily explained by conventional knowledge. When they reached town, Tyler faced the dilemma of what to do with their experience. His first instinct was to report their encounters to the Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks Department, both as a matter of public safety and to document what they'd seen. But he was concerned about how such a report would be received, especially given his reputation in the hunting community. Tyler decided to start with a phone call to the regional Fish and Game office, speaking with a biologist he'd worked with on previous wildlife issues. He described their encounters in general terms, focusing on the evidence they'd found rather than the visual sightings. The biologist listened politely, but offered no explanations for the tracks, vocalizations, or other evidence Tyler described. The conversation was professional but ultimately unsatisfying. Tyler got the impression that the biologist had heard similar reports before but was reluctant to acknowledge or investigate them officially. The suggestion was made that Tyler submit written documentation of his observations, but there was no indication that any follow-up investigation would be conducted. Over the following days, Tyler found himself consumed by thoughts about their encounter. He researched similar reports from other parts of North America, discovering a surprising volume of accounts that described encounters with large, unknown primates. The reports came from credible witnesses, hunters, hikers, Forest Service employees, and others with substantial wilderness experience. Tyler also found himself changing his hunting patterns, avoiding the area where they'd had their encounter, and feeling uneasy in wilderness areas where he'd previously felt completely comfortable. The experience had shaken his confidence in his understanding of Montana's wildlife, and he found himself constantly scanning tree lines and listening for unusual sounds. Marcus handled the experience differently, approaching it as a scientific puzzle that needed to be solved. He researched primate biology, reading scientific papers about unknown species discovery and the possibility of large primates surviving in North American wilderness areas. His medical training made him reluctant to accept anything that couldn't be proven scientifically, but he also couldn't dismiss what he'd seen with his own eyes. 3 weeks after their encounter, Tyler made the decision to return to the area alone. His rational mind told him it was a bad idea, but his hunter's instincts demanded that he try to gather more evidence about what they'd encountered. He planned a day hunt, hiking in early morning and staying only long enough to examine the area where they'd found tracks and other evidence. The forest felt different when Tyler returned. The oppressive silence that had characterized their hunting trip was gone, replaced by normal sounds of wildlife activity. Birds were singing, squirrels were chattering, and the area seemed to have returned to its usual patterns of life. Tyler interpreted this as evidence that whatever presence had been in the area during their hunt had moved on. He found the tree with claw marks, but they had weathered considerably in the 3 weeks since their discovery. The tracks around their old campsite had been obliterated by rain and wind, leaving no evidence of the unusual activity they'd documented. Tyler spent several hours searching for additional sign, but found nothing that suggested the continued presence of whatever they'd encountered. Tyler left the area that afternoon with mixed feelings. Part of him was relieved that the oppressive atmosphere of their hunting trip seemed to have lifted, but part of him was disappointed that he couldn't find additional evidence to validate their experience. He was left with memories, photographs that showed little detail, and questions that would likely never be answered satisfactorily. In the months that followed, Tyler found himself telling the story to a select few people, hunters and outdoorsmen whose judgment he trusted and who might have had similar experiences. The responses were mixed. Some listeners dismissed the account as imagination or misidentification, while others shared their own stories of unusual encounters in Montana wilderness areas. Tyler learned that reports of similar creatures were more common than he'd realized, especially among people who spent significant time in remote wilderness areas. Forest Service employees, hunting guides, and experienced outdoorsmen had encountered evidence of something large and unknown, but official acknowledgement of such encounters was rare. The experience changed Tyler's relationship with the wilderness in subtle but significant ways. He continued hunting and hiking, but he found himself more aware of his surroundings, more attuned to unusual sounds or signs, and more respectful of the possibility that Montana's forests might harbor species that science hadn't yet documented or acknowledged. Tyler also found himself becoming something of an unofficial collector of similar accounts. Other hunters began sharing their stories with him, describing encounters with large, unknown creatures in various parts of Montana. The accounts were remarkably consistent in their descriptions of size, behavior, and intelligence, suggesting that multiple people were encountering the same type of creature. One particularly compelling account came from a Forest Service employee who described finding similar tracks near Glacier National Park. The employee had photographed the tracks and submitted them through official channels, but the report had apparently been filed away without investigation. The employee was reluctant to discuss the encounter officially, but was willing to share details privately with Tyler. Another account came from a hunting guide who had been working in the Bob Marshall Wilderness for over 20 years. He described multiple encounters with something large and unknown, including vocalizations similar to what Tyler and Marcus had heard. The guide had stopped reporting such encounters after being told by his employer that discussing them was bad for business and could damage the outfitting company's reputation. These conversations convinced Tyler that their encounter was part of a larger pattern of sightings and evidence that was being systematically ignored or suppressed by official agencies. The reasons for this apparent cover-up were unclear, but Tyler speculated that acknowledgement of unknown species in popular wilderness areas might create public safety concerns or impact tourism and recreation industries. Tyler's broken collarbone occurred during his final encounter with the creature, an incident that happened 6 months after his initial experience with Marcus. Tyler had returned to the hunting area several times during the intervening months, partly driven by curiosity and partly hoping to gather additional evidence that might validate their original encounter. On this particular morning in March, Tyler was hiking through the area on snowshoes, ostensibly checking for winter wildlife sign, but really hoping to find evidence that the creatures were still using the area. The snow was deep and conditions were challenging, but Tyler was experienced in winter travel and comfortable moving through the mountains in harsh conditions. Around 10 o'clock, while crossing a small meadow, Tyler heard a sound that made him stop instantly. It was the same type of vocalization he and Marcus had heard during their September hunt, a howl or scream that seemed to combine animal and human elements. The sound came from the timber on the far side of the meadow, perhaps 100 yards away. Tyler stood perfectly still, listening for additional sounds and trying to locate the source of the vocalization. The call was answered by another sound from a different direction, confirming that multiple creatures were in the area and communicating with each other. Tyler felt the same mixture of fear and fascination that had characterized his original encounter. Then he saw movement in the timber, something large moving through the trees toward his position. Tyler's first instinct was to retreat, but his curiosity overcame his caution. He waited, hoping to get another clear look at whatever was approaching. The creature emerged from the tree line at the edge of the meadow, moving with the same fluid grace Tyler remembered from his previous sightings. But this time, instead of observing from a distance, the creature was clearly approaching Tyler directly. Its movements showed no signs of aggression, but Tyler suddenly realized he might have made a serious error in judgment by returning to the area alone. Tyler slowly reached for his bow, more as a precautionary measure than with any intent to shoot. He'd brought hunting equipment partly to maintain the pretense of checking winter game sign, but he had no intention of attempting to harvest something he didn't understand and couldn't legally tag. But as Tyler drew his bow, the creature's behavior changed dramatically. What had been a calm, measured approach suddenly became an explosive charge. The creature covered the remaining 60 yards between them in seconds, moving with speed that seemed impossible for something so large. Tyler's hunter instincts took over, and he attempted to nock an arrow while backing away from the approaching creature. But his snowshoes tangled in the deep snow, and he fell backward just as the creature reached his position. Tyler's bow went flying, and he felt something pop in his shoulder as he hit the ground hard. The creature loomed over Tyler for perhaps 3 seconds, long enough for Tyler to see facial features clearly and to smell a musky odor that was unlike anything he'd encountered in the wilderness. The face was distinctly primate-like, but much larger and more pronounced than any ape, with intelligent eyes that seemed to be evaluating Tyler as both threat and curiosity. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature stepped back and melted into the timber, leaving Tyler alone in the meadow with a dislocated shoulder and the certain knowledge that he'd just had a close encounter with something that science insisted didn't exist. Tyler managed to reset his shoulder using a technique he'd learned during wilderness first aid training, but the injury would require medical attention. He collected his scattered gear and began the painful hike back to his vehicle, moving carefully on snowshoes while favoring his injured shoulder. The hike out gave Tyler time to process what had just happened. The creature's approach and sudden charge suggested territorial behavior, a warning to stay away from an area it considered its domain. Tyler interpreted the encounter as a clear message that his continued visits to the area were unwelcome and potentially dangerous. When Tyler reached the hospital in Bozeman, X-rays revealed a broken collarbone in addition to the shoulder dislocation. The attending physician asked how the injury had occurred, and Tyler found himself describing a snowshoeing accident that involved catching an edge and falling awkwardly. The truth seemed too fantastic to share with medical personnel who would likely question his mental stability. The injury required several weeks of healing and physical therapy, during which Tyler had ample time to reflect on his encounters and decide what to do with his experiences. His broken collarbone served as a tangible reminder that whatever he'd been encountering was real, powerful, and potentially dangerous. Tyler eventually decided to make an official report to Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks, despite his concerns about how it would be received. He prepared a detailed written account of all his encounters, including photographs of tracks and claw marks, GPS coordinates of sighting locations, and descriptions of the creature's behavior and physical characteristics. The report was submitted to the regional wildlife biologist Tyler had spoken with previously. Tyler included his contact information and offered to provide additional details or to guide investigators to the areas where he'd made his observations. He emphasized his credentials as an experienced hunter and outdoorsman, hoping his reputation would lend credibility to his account. The response from Fish, Wildlife and Parks was polite but non-committal. Tyler received a form letter acknowledging receipt of his report and thanking him for his interest in Montana wildlife. The letter stated that his observations would be reviewed by appropriate personnel, but no follow-up contact was ever made. Tyler later learned through unofficial channels that reports of unknown creatures were fairly common, but were typically filed away without investigation. Budget constraints, personnel limitations, and the controversial nature of such reports made official investigation unlikely unless physical evidence could be produced. This response frustrated Tyler, but it also confirmed his suspicion that his encounters were part of a larger pattern of sightings that were being systematically ignored by official agencies. Tyler began to understand why other witnesses had been reluctant to report their encounters or discuss them publicly. In the years since his encounters, Tyler has become more selective about sharing his experiences. He's learned to recognize people who might be receptive to his account and to avoid those who would likely dismiss or ridicule his story. Tyler has also connected with other witnesses through informal networks of hunters and outdoorsmen who have had similar experiences. These connections have revealed that encounters with unknown primates are much more common in Montana than official sources acknowledge. Tyler has collected dozens of accounts from credible witnesses, each describing creatures that match his own observations in terms of size, behavior, and physical characteristics. Tyler has also learned that similar encounters are reported throughout the Pacific Northwest, the northern Rocky Mountains, and other remote areas, wilderness areas of North America. The consistency of these reports across geographic regions and witness backgrounds suggests that people are encountering the same type of creature rather than fabricating similar stories independently. Despite the lack of official acknowledgement or investigation, Tyler remains convinced that Montana's wilderness areas harbor populations of large, unknown primates. His encounters have given him a profound respect for the intelligence and territorial behavior of these creatures, and he's modified his hunting and hiking patterns to avoid areas where he suspects they might be present. Tyler's broken collarbone has healed completely, but the psychological impact of his encounters continues to influence his relationship with the wilderness. He's more cautious now, more aware of his surroundings, and more respectful of the possibility that humans might not be the only intelligent species using Montana's remote wilderness areas. The official response to Tyler's report, or lack thereof, has also given him insight into the complex political and economic factors that might influence how such encounters are handled by government agencies. Tourism, hunting, and outdoor recreation represent significant economic interests in Montana, and official acknowledgement of unknown and potentially dangerous creatures in popular wilderness areas could have substantial financial implications. Tyler continues to hunt and hike in Montana wilderness areas, but he approaches these activities with a new understanding of his place in the natural world. His encounters have taught him that the forests he thought he knew completely still hold mysteries that science hasn't acknowledged or explained. Today, more than 2 years after his final encounter, Tyler still struggles with questions about what he experienced and what it means. He's certain that he encountered something real, something intelligent, and something that deserves respect and protection. But he's also frustrated by the lack of official recognition or investigation of such encounters. Tyler has considered writing a book about his experiences, but he's concerned about the impact such publicity might have on his reputation and business. He's also worried that increased attention might lead to harassment of the creatures he encountered, or worse, attempts by trophy hunters or thrill seekers to track down and kill specimens. For now, Tyler continues to collect accounts from other witnesses and to document evidence when he encounters it. He hopes that eventually the accumulation of reports and evidence will force official acknowledgement of what many wilderness users have long suspected: that North America's forests harbor species that science has yet to discover or accept. Tyler's encounters have changed his perspective on wildlife management, scientific methodology, and the relationship between humans and the natural world. He's learned that eyewitness accounts, even from experienced and credible observers, carry little weight in scientific or official circles without physical evidence that meets rigid standards of proof. But Tyler has also learned that the absence of official acknowledgement doesn't negate the reality of his experiences. He knows what he saw, what he heard, and what caused his broken collarbone. That knowledge has given him a deep respect for the mysteries that still exist in Montana's wilderness, and a humble appreciation for how much humans still don't understand about the natural world. The broken collarbone serves as a permanent reminder of Tyler's encounters, a physical scar that validates experiences that others might dismiss as imagination or misidentification. When people question the reality of his encounters, Tyler can point to medical records that document an injury that occurred during an interaction with something powerful enough to cause him to fall and break bones. Tyler's story illustrates the complex challenges faced by people who encounter phenomena that don't fit within accepted scientific paradigms. Despite his credentials, experience, and physical evidence, Tyler found that official channels offered no meaningful response to his reports. This experience has taught him to value informal networks of witnesses and to approach wilderness areas with greater humility and respect for unknown possibilities. The encounters have also reinforced Tyler's commitment to ethical hunting and wildlife conservation. His interactions with intelligent, unknown creatures have deepened his appreciation for all wildlife and strengthened his belief that humans have a responsibility to protect and preserve wilderness areas that serve as habitat for both known and unknown species. Tyler Brooks continues to hunt the mountains of Montana, but he does so with the knowledge that he shares those mountains with creatures that science doesn't acknowledge and officials won't investigate. His broken collarbone has healed, but the memory of what caused it remains vivid, serving as a reminder that the natural world still holds mysteries that challenge human understanding and demand respect. The next case, Matthew Johnson adjusted the rearview mirror of his weathered Ford F-150 for the third time in 10 minutes, watching the familiar suburban sprawl of Portland fade into memory behind him. The digital clock on his dashboard read 6:47 a.m., and the October morning carried that crisp bite that promised winter wasn't far behind. Steam rose from his travel mug of black coffee, mixing with the fog that clung to the Cascade foothills like ghostly fingers reaching down from the mountains. At 42, Matthew had spent the better part of 2 decades as a wilderness guide and survival instructor, leading corporate retreat groups and weekend warriors through some of the Pacific Northwest's most challenging terrain. His weathered hands gripped the steering wheel with the confidence of someone who had navigated these mountain roads countless times, but today felt different. Today, he wasn't leading a group of executives through team-building exercises or teaching Boy Scout troops how to start fires without matches. Today, he was answering a call that had come 3 days ago from Dr. Sarah Chen, a primatologist from Portland State University, who had specifically requested his services for what she termed a specialized research expedition. The conversation had been brief but intriguing. Dr. Chen had mentioned studying primate behavior patterns in remote wilderness environments, and while she hadn't been entirely forthcoming about the specifics, the substantial compensation she offered had been impossible to ignore. Matthew's guide service had been struggling since the pandemic, and the autumn booking season had been particularly lean. The check she'd sent as a down payment had been enough to cover his mortgage for 3 months. As his truck climbed the winding highway toward Mount Hood National Forest, Matthew reflected on his credentials that had likely impressed Dr. Chen. His military background in the Army Rangers had given him skills in navigation, survival, and threat assessment that translated perfectly to civilian wilderness guiding. After his discharge, he'd earned certifications in wilderness first aid, emergency medical response, and search and rescue operations. His knowledge of Pacific Northwest flora and fauna was encyclopedic, gained through years of practical experience and formal study at Oregon State University, where he'd completed a degree in forestry before economic necessity had pulled him away from graduate school. The truck's CB radio crackled to life, breaking his reverie. Unit 7 to base, over. The voice belonged to Jake Morrison, a fellow guide who occasionally partnered with Matthew on larger expeditions. Jake had agreed to join this particular trip, partly for the money and partly because he was curious about Dr. Chen's research. At 38, Jake was a former Marine with wilderness medicine training and an uncanny ability to track wildlife that had made him invaluable on numerous search and rescue operations. "Go ahead, Unit 7, Matthew responded, picking up the handset. "I'm about 15 minutes behind you, just past the Zigzag station. Doc Chen's vehicle is running about 20 minutes back. Weather report says we might see some early snow flurries up at elevation, but nothing significant. Still planning to meet at the Timberline trailhead?" "Affirmative. I'll start unloading gear and wait for you both. Estimated arrival at the coordinates she provided is around 1100 hours if we maintain current pace." "Copy that. Jake out." Matthew had studied the topographical maps Dr. Chen had provided extensively over the past 3 days. Their destination was a remote section of the Mount Hood wilderness, accessible only by a challenging 15-mile hike through dense, old-growth forest. The area was known for its pristine ecosystem and minimal human presence, which apparently made it ideal for whatever research Dr. Chen had planned. The coordinates led to a natural clearing near a freshwater creek, surrounded by massive Douglas fir and western hemlock trees that had been growing for centuries before the first European settlers had ever set foot in Oregon. The region held a complicated history that Matthew had researched as part of his preparation. The Warm Springs, Wasco, and Paiute tribes had considered this area sacred hunting grounds for generations before white settlement. Local tribal legends spoke of powerful spirits that dwelled in the deepest parts of the forest, beings that commanded respect and maintained the balance between the human and natural worlds. Matthew had always been respectful of indigenous perspectives on the land. having learned early in his guiding career that traditional ecological knowledge often provided insights that modern science was only beginning to understand. As he turned onto the Forest Service road that would take him to Timberline Lodge, Matthew's thoughts drifted to the equipment manifest Dr. Chen had requested. Beyond the standard camping and survival gear, she had specifically asked for high-quality audio recording equipment, trail cameras with infrared capability, and measurement tools that seemed more suited to archaeological excavation than wildlife research. When he'd questioned her about these requirements, she'd been evasive, mentioning only that they might need to document unusual behavioral evidence during their 4-day expedition. The truck bounced over a particularly deep pothole, jarring Matthew back to the present. The Forest Service road was deteriorating rapidly as he gained elevation, and he shifted into 4-wheel drive to maintain traction on the increasingly steep grade. Towering evergreens closed in on both sides of the narrow road, their massive trunks disappearing into the misty canopy above. The understory was thick with ferns, salmonberry bushes, and moss-covered fallen logs that created an ecosystem within an ecosystem. This was old-growth forest at its most pristine, virtually unchanged for thousands of years. A movement in the trees caught his attention, and Matthew slowed the truck to observe a small herd of Roosevelt elk grazing in a natural meadow visible through a gap in the forest. The massive animals moved with careful deliberation, their heads lifting periodically to scan for potential threats. Matthew had guided countless hunting parties in pursuit of elk like these, but he never tired of watching them in their natural habitat. The lead cow, likely an experienced matriarch, kept herself positioned between the herd and the road, demonstrating the kind of protective behavior that had helped these animals survive in predator-rich environments for millennia. The parking area at Timberline Lodge was nearly deserted when Matthew arrived, which wasn't surprising given the late season and weekday timing. A few hardcore hikers were preparing for day trips, but the serious backpacking season was winding down as winter approached. Matthew parked near the trailhead information board and began systematically checking his gear while waiting for his companions. His backpack was a testament to 20 years of wilderness experience, every item carefully selected for reliability and efficiency. The sleeping system consisted of a down bag rated to -20 degrees Fahrenheit and a closed-cell foam pad that would provide insulation from the cold ground. His shelter was an ultralight mountaineering tent designed to withstand severe weather conditions. The first aid kit was extensive, including prescription medications for emergency situations, suture materials, and a satellite communicator for emergency evacuation if needed. For this expedition, Matthew had also packed specialized equipment at Dr. Chen's request, a professional-grade digital recorder with parabolic microphone attachments sat carefully cushioned in his pack, along with extra batteries and memory cards. Motion-activated trail cameras with infrared flash capability would allow them to monitor animal activity during their absence from camp. Most unusually, Dr. Chen had requested plaster casting materials and precise measurement tools typically used by forensic investigators or archaeologists. Jake's truck appeared around the bend just as Matthew finished his gear check, followed closely by a late-model Subaru Outback that presumably belonged to Dr. Chen. Jake parked beside Matthew's F-150 and climbed out, stretching his tall frame after the long drive. At 6 feet 4 inches, Jake had the lean build of someone who spent most of his time outdoors, with prematurely grey hair that made him look older than his 38 years. "Morning, Matt. Beautiful day for a hike into the unknown, wouldn't you say?" Jake's humor had a slightly sardonic edge that came from years of leading clients into situations they weren't fully prepared for. Dr. Sarah Chen emerged from the Subaru with the efficient movements of someone accustomed to fieldwork. She was smaller than Matthew had expected, perhaps 5 feet 6 inches tall, with black hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and the kind of wire-rimmed glasses that suggested serious academic credentials. Her clothing was high-quality outdoor gear, but worn in a way that indicated genuine use rather than weekend hiking enthusiasm. "Gentlemen, thank you for accommodating this expedition on relatively short notice," she said, approaching them with a confident stride. "I apologize for being somewhat vague about our objectives during our phone conversations, but I felt it was important that we discuss the specifics in person, away from potential interference." Matthew and Jake exchanged a glance. The phrase "potential interference" was not typical vocabulary for wildlife research expeditions. "Dr. Chen, before we head into the wilderness, I think we need a clearer understanding of what exactly we're looking for out there," Matthew said. "The equipment requests and location specifications suggest this isn't a standard primate behavioral study." Dr. Chen looked around the parking area, confirming they were alone, except for a couple of day hikers who were too far away to overhear. "You're absolutely correct, Matthew. This expedition is focused on investigating reports of an unidentified primate species that has been documented in this region over the past 18 months. I'm part of a research team that has been quietly investigating similar reports throughout the Pacific Northwest, and this particular area has shown the most consistent evidence." Jake raised an eyebrow. "When you say unidentified primate species, are we talking about Sasquatch? Bigfoot? I prefer to use the term unidentified primate until we have sufficient data to support more specific classifications," Dr. Chen replied carefully. "However, the eyewitness reports and physical evidence we've collected do suggest a large bipedal primate that doesn't match any known species in the fossil record or current taxonomic categories." Matthew felt a mixture of skepticism and intrigue. He'd heard Sasquatch stories throughout his career, mostly from clients who claimed to have seen something unusual during their wilderness adventures. Most of these accounts could be explained by misidentification of known animals, environmental factors, or simple fabrication. However, Dr. Chen's academic credentials and methodical approach suggested she was taking a scientific approach to the question. "What kind of evidence are we talking about?" Matthew asked. Dr. Chen walked to her vehicle and returned with a tablet computer. She scrolled through several photographs showing what appeared to be large footprints in mud and forest duff. The prints were distinctly humanoid, but significantly larger than any human foot, with clear impressions of toes and what appeared to be dermal ridges similar to fingerprints. "These were photographed 6 weeks ago, approximately 3 miles from our destination coordinates," she explained. "The individual prints measure 18 inches in length and 7 inches at the widest point. The stride length suggests a bipedal creature approximately 8 to 9 feet tall, with an estimated weight of 600 to 800 pounds, based on the depth of impression in various soil conditions." Jake studied the images carefully. "Could these be fabricated? I've seen some pretty convincing fake footprints over the years." "That was my initial assumption, Doctor," Chen replied. "However, microscopic analysis of the dermal ridge patterns and the consistent biomechanical characteristics across multiple print sites suggest these are genuine. More importantly, we've documented these prints in locations that would be extremely difficult to access for hoaxing purposes, and the preservation conditions indicate they were made during specific weather events that we can verify through meteorological records." Matthew examined the tablet more closely. The prints did appear authentic, showing the kind of natural variation and wear patterns that would be difficult to fabricate convincingly. The surrounding vegetation in the photographs showed clear signs of recent passage by something large, with broken branches and compressed undergrowth consistent with the size of creature the footprints suggested. "There's more, Doctor," Chen continued, scrolling to audio files on the tablet. We've recorded vocalizations that don't match any known Pacific Northwest wildlife. These recordings were made using equipment similar to what you've packed for this expedition. She played a 30-second audio clip that made Matthew's skin crawl. The sound was definitely animal in origin, but unlike anything he'd encountered in 20 years of wilderness experience. It began as a low, rumbling growl that gradually increased in pitch and volume, culminating in what could only be described as a roar, but with an almost human quality that was deeply unsettling. The frequency analysis shows this vocalization covers a range that extends well below normal human hearing, which is consistent with large primate communication patterns, Dr. Chen explained. The audio was recorded at approximately 2:30 a.m. from a distance of roughly 200 meters. Jake's expression had grown more serious. Have you had any visual confirmations? Actual sightings? 3 documented sightings by credible witnesses over the past 14 months, Doctor, Chen replied. 2 were researchers from our team, and 1 was a local hunting guide with extensive wilderness experience. All 3 described a large, dark-colored, bipedal creature covered in hair with facial features that appeared more human than ape-like. Matthew's practical mind was working through the implications. Assuming there's something to investigate, what exactly is our mission? Are we trying to observe this creature? Collect more evidence? What are the safety protocols if we actually encounter something? Our primary objective is documentation and evidence collection, Dr. Chen said. I want to establish a base camp near the area where the most recent activity has been recorded and conduct systematic monitoring using the trail cameras and audio equipment. If we observe the creature directly, our priority is non-intrusive documentation. Under no circumstances are we to attempt capture or aggressive confrontation. And if this thing decides it doesn't want to be documented, Jake asked. Dr. Chen's expression grew more serious. Based on the evidence we've collected, this creature appears to be highly intelligent and generally avoids human contact. However, we should treat it as we would any large, powerful wildlife. Maintain distance, avoid threatening behavior, and be prepared to retreat if necessary. Matthew checked his watch. It was approaching 9:30, and they had a long hike ahead of them. All right, let's get moving. We can continue this discussion on the trail. I want to reach the campsite with plenty of daylight for setup. The 3 spent the next 30 minutes doing final gear checks and organizing their loads. Dr. Chen carried a pack that was clearly designed for serious fieldwork, with external attachments for recording equipment and sample collection materials. Jake's load included emergency medical supplies and supplemental food rations that could extend their expedition if circumstances required. The trailhead began with a well-maintained path that gradually degraded as they moved away from the popular day hiking areas. Matthew led the group, setting a steady pace that would cover ground efficiently without exhausting them before they reached their destination. The trail wound through a forest that seemed to grow more primeval with each mile, massive trees creating a cathedral-like canopy that filtered the morning sunlight into shifting patterns of light and shadow. As they hiked, Dr. Chen provided more details about her research team's findings. The organization she represented was a consortium of academic institutions and private researchers who had been quietly investigating cryptid reports throughout North America for the past 5 years. Their approach was rigorously scientific, focusing on physical evidence and eliminating cases that could be explained by conventional means. The challenge with this field of study is the amount of false information and deliberate hoaxing that occurs, she explained as they navigated a particularly steep section of trail. For every genuine piece of evidence, we encounter dozens of fabricated claims, misidentifications, and outright fraud. However, When we apply strict scientific methodology and focus on cases with multiple independent corroborations, a pattern emerges that suggests something genuine is occurring. Matthew had to admit that Dr. Chen's approach was more convincing than the typical Sasquatch enthusiast rhetoric he'd encountered over the years. Her emphasis on evidence and methodology rather than sensational claims gave her credibility that most cryptid researchers lacked. The trail began to level out as they approached a ridge that offered views across the surrounding wilderness. From this vantage point, the true scale of the Pacific Northwest forest became apparent. Millions of acres of unbroken forest stretched to the horizon, broken only by the occasional clear-cut or natural meadow. It was easy to imagine how a large, intelligent creature could remain hidden in such vast expanses of wilderness. The indigenous peoples of this region have traditions about these creatures that go back centuries, Dr. Chen continued as they paused for water and trail mix. The Warm Springs tribes have specific protocols for encounters with what they call the forest people. These aren't mythological stories, but practical guidelines for coexistence with what they consider another tribe sharing the same territory. Jake wiped sweat from his forehead, despite the cool October air. Have you consulted with tribal representatives about your research? Absolutely. In fact, much of our early evidence came from tribal members who were willing to share their knowledge. They've been very clear that these creatures should be approached with respect and caution. According to their traditions, the forest people are generally peaceful, but can become dangerous if they feel threatened or if their territory is violated. As they resumed hiking, Matthew found himself paying closer attention to the forest around them. His trained eye automatically catalogued the normal signs of wildlife activity: deer trails, bear scratches on trees, bird nests, and the subtle indicators of ecosystem health. However, he was now also looking for anomalies, anything that might suggest the presence of something unusual. The trail began to descend toward a creek drainage, and the character of the forest changed noticeably. The trees here were even larger, with some Douglas firs and western hemlocks that had clearly been growing for 4 or 5 centuries. The understory was thick with devil's club, ferns, and moss-covered fallen logs that created a jungle-like environment. The air was noticeably cooler and more humid, carrying the rich scent of decomposing organic matter and flowing water. As they approached their destination coordinates, Matthew began looking for suitable camping spots. Dr. Chen's requirements were specific. They needed access to fresh water, good visibility for observation, and multiple escape routes in case of emergency. The clearing she had identified on the maps proved to be ideal, with a small creek providing water and several large logs that could serve as windbreaks for their tents. "This is perfect, Doctor," Chen said as they emerged into the clearing. "The creek will mask our scent and provide white noise to cover our movements. The tree line offers good concealment for observation, and we have clear sight lines in multiple directions." Matthew began unpacking his gear systematically, a process honed by years of wilderness camping. The tent went up first, positioned to take advantage of natural windbreaks, while maintaining quick access to gear stored in the vestibule. Jake worked on establishing a cooking area using principles of leave-no-trace camping, while Dr. Chen began setting up her recording equipment at strategic points around the clearing. The trail cameras were particularly sophisticated devices, capable of high-resolution photography and video recording triggered by motion sensors. Dr. Chen positioned them to cover the most likely approach routes, camouflaging them carefully to avoid detection. The audio recording equipment included directional microphones that could be oriented remotely and a central recording unit that would capture sound throughout the night. As the afternoon wore on, the three worked efficiently to establish their base camp. Matthew gathered firewood and prepared a fire ring, though Dr. Chen requested that they minimize smoke and light after sunset to avoid deterring any potential wildlife activity. Jake used his medical training to establish a first aid station and evacuation procedures, including GPS coordinates for helicopter landing zones if emergency extraction became necessary. The weather remained stable throughout the afternoon, with occasional breaks in the cloud cover that allowed patches of sunlight to penetrate the forest canopy. The temperature hovered around 50 degrees Fahrenheit, comfortable for hiking but requiring warm layers during periods of inactivity. According to the weather forecast, they could expect similar conditions for the next 3 days, with a possibility of light rain on their final day. As evening approached, Dr. Chen called the group together for a briefing on their observation procedures. Based on previous activity in this area, the most likely time for encounters is between sunset and sunrise. We'll maintain a watch schedule that ensures someone is always monitoring the recording equipment and observing the perimeter. She showed them a detailed map of the area with grid references and predetermined observation points. If anyone observes unusual activity, the priority is documentation, followed by communication with the rest of the team. We have hand signals for silent communication and predetermined retreat routes if the situation becomes threatening. Matthew appreciated the methodical approach, which mirrored the kind of planning he used for his most challenging wilderness expeditions. However, he couldn't shake a growing sense of unease as shadows began to lengthen across the clearing. The forest seemed to be settling into evening rhythms, with bird activity diminishing and the subtle shift in atmosphere that preceded nightfall in deep wilderness. Jake was checking the emergency communication equipment when he paused and held up a hand for silence. All three listened intently to the forest sounds around them. The normal evening chorus of birds and insects seemed muted, replaced by an unusual quiet that experienced wilderness travelers knew often indicated the presence of large predators. "Could be a bear moving through the area," Matthew said quietly. "Or elk. Sometimes their presence affects other wildlife activity." Dr. Chen was already activating her recording equipment, adjusting the directional microphones to cover different areas around their camp. "Whatever it is, we'll have documentation if it comes closer." As they prepared dinner over a small camp stove, the conversation turned to their backgrounds and what had brought them to this unusual expedition. Jake shared stories from his military service in Afghanistan, where he'd learned to trust his instincts about environmental changes that might indicate danger. Matthew talked about some of his more challenging guiding experiences, including a winter rescue operation that had required him to navigate through a blizzard to reach stranded climbers. Dr. Chen was more reserved about her personal background, but she did mention that her interest in cryptid research had begun during her graduate studies in primatology. "I was studying bonobo communication patterns in the Democratic Republic of Congo when I encountered local reports of unknown primates that didn't fit established taxonomic categories. The similarities between those reports and Pacific Northwest Sasquatch accounts were too significant to ignore. As darkness fell, the character of the forest changed dramatically, the temperature dropped noticeably, and the sounds that had been muted during the evening became completely absent. The silence was so complete that it seemed almost unnatural, broken only by the gentle sound of water flowing in the nearby creek. Matthew had experienced this kind of forest silence before, usually in the presence of large predators like bears or mountain lions. However, this felt different somehow, more intentional and sustained than typical wildlife interactions. He found himself listening intently for any sound that might indicate what was causing the unusual quiet. Dr. Chen was monitoring her recording equipment through headphones, occasionally adjusting settings or changing the orientation of the directional microphones. Her expression was focused and alert, suggesting she was detecting something through the sensitive audio equipment that wasn't audible to unassisted hearing. Around 10 o'clock, Jake reported the first unusual observation. Movement in the tree line, approximately 50 meters northeast of camp, he whispered, using the hand signals, Doctor. Chen had taught them to indicate direction and distance. Matthew followed Jake's sightline and spotted what appeared to be a large shadow moving between the massive tree trunks. The movement was too large and coordinated to be explained by wind-blown vegetation, but it was difficult to make out specific details in the darkness. Doctor, Chen adjusted her equipment to focus on the area Jake had indicated, and after several minutes of careful observation, she confirmed that something was moving in the forest. The audio equipment is picking up very low-frequency sounds, almost like breathing, but much larger than any known Pacific Northwest wildlife. The three maintained silent observation for nearly an hour, during which the presence in the forest seemed to circle their camp at a consistent distance. Occasionally, they caught glimpses of movement, but nothing clear enough to definitively identify. The audio equipment recorded continuous low-frequency sounds that suggested something large was indeed moving through the forest. Around midnight, the presence seemed to withdraw, and normal forest sounds gradually returned. Dr. Chen's equipment continued recording, but the immediate sense of being observed gradually diminished. First night is often like this, Doctor. Chen explained quietly as they prepared for sleep. Based on our previous expeditions, initial contact is usually limited to this kind of reconnaissance behavior. If the creature is intelligent, which all evidence suggests, it would naturally want to assess potential threats before making closer approach. Matthew took the first watch, positioned where he could observe the perimeter while monitoring Dr. Chen's recording equipment. The forest remained relatively quiet, with only occasional normal wildlife sounds breaking the silence. However, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were still being watched from somewhere beyond the range of their equipment. Jake relieved him at 2 a.m., and Matthew settled into his sleeping bag, grateful for the warmth and comfort after hours in the cold night air. However, sleep came reluctantly as his mind processed the evening's events. The rational part of his consciousness insisted that they had probably observed normal wildlife behavior, possibly a bear or elk that had been curious about their presence. However, something about the sustained, intelligent nature of the observation suggested they might indeed be dealing with something unprecedented. Dr. Chen took the final watch from 4 to 6 a.m., and when Matthew awakened at dawn, she reported that the night had remained quiet after Jake's shift. However, her recording equipment had captured several hours of unusual audio that would require careful analysis to interpret. As morning light filtered through the forest canopy, the three began their second day with a systematic search of the area for physical evidence. Dr. Chen had brought GPS equipment that would allow them to map any findings precisely, and she wanted to establish a baseline of normal wildlife activity before looking for anomalies. The forest in daylight revealed details that had been invisible during the previous evening's observations. The massive trees created a complex, three-dimensional environment with multiple levels of understory vegetation. Fallen logs, some as large as buildings, created natural corridors and hiding places that could easily conceal large animals. Jake's military tracking experience proved invaluable as they searched for signs of the previous night's visitor. He identified several areas where vegetation had been disturbed, including broken branches and compressed undergrowth that suggested something large had passed through. However, the forest floor was too covered with organic debris to show clear footprints. Around mid-morning, Matthew made the first significant discovery. In a muddy area near the creek, approximately 200 meters from their camp, he found a clear impression in the soft soil that matched the photographs Dr. Chen had shown them during their initial briefing. "This is fresh," he called to his companions, using GPS to mark the exact location. "Made within the last 12 hours based on the soil conditions and preservation." "Doctor?" Chen approached with her documentation equipment, photographing the print from multiple angles and taking precise measurements. The footprint was indeed 18 inches long and clearly showed toe impressions and what appeared to be dermal ridges. Most importantly, it was positioned in a location that would be extremely difficult to access for hoaxing purposes, requiring someone to wade through chest-deep brush to reach the muddy area. The depth and clarity suggest significant weight, consistent with our estimates based on previous finds, Doctor, Chen noted as she prepared plaster casting materials. The preservation is excellent, which will allow for detailed forensic analysis. Jake discovered additional evidence nearby, including hair samples caught on low-hanging branches and areas where large stones had been displaced in patterns that suggested intentional manipulation rather than natural processes. Whatever was here last night was definitely investigating our camp, Jake concluded. The approach pattern and evidence locations suggest systematic reconnaissance behavior. As they documented their findings, Matthew became increasingly convinced that they were dealing with something extraordinary. The evidence was too consistent and too well preserved to be explained by conventional wildlife or hoaxing. Moreover, the intelligent behavior patterns suggested by the discovery locations indicated they were observing something with cognitive abilities far beyond typical forest animals. The second afternoon was spent establishing additional monitoring positions and expanding their search radius. Dr. Chen wanted to document the creature's normal behavior patterns and territory markers before attempting any direct observation. The trail cameras were repositioned to cover a wider area, and additional audio recording stations were established at strategic points. As evening approached, the three prepared for their second night with increased anticipation. The previous night's contact had established that something was indeed present in the area, and Dr. Chen's research suggested that sustained presence by researchers often led to closer encounters as the creature's curiosity overcame its caution. The weather had remained stable throughout the day, but clouds were gathering that suggested possible precipitation during the night. Dr. Chen was concerned that rain might interfere with their electronic equipment, but she also noted that previous research had shown increased activity during unsettled weather conditions. As twilight deepened, the forest again became unusually quiet, but this time the silence seemed more charged with anticipation. Matthew found his senses heightened beyond their normal wilderness alertness, every sound and movement registering with unusual intensity. Dr. Chen's equipment began detecting activity much earlier than the previous night, with low-frequency sounds registering on her instruments, while the forest still appeared empty to visual observation. "Something's definitely approaching," she whispered. "Much larger than anything we recorded last night." Jake had positioned himself with night vision equipment that would allow limited observation without artificial light that might deter their visitor. After nearly an hour of patient waiting, he reported the first clear sighting. "Visual contact approximately 100 meters northwest," he whispered, his voice tight with controlled excitement. "Large, upright figure moving between the trees, height approximately 8 feet, covered in dark hair or fur." Matthew strained to see what Jake was observing, but the darkness and forest cover made visual confirmation impossible without equipment. However, Dr. Chen's audio recording was clearly documenting something extraordinary. The sounds were similar to the previous night, but much clearer and closer, including what sounded like deliberate vocalizations rather than random animal noises. For nearly 2 hours, they maintained observation while the creature moved through the forest around their camp. Unlike the previous night's distant reconnaissance, this behavior seemed more confident and curious. Several times, Jake reported that the figure had approached to within 50 meters of their position before withdrawing back into the trees. "Around 11 p.m., Doctor." Chen's equipment registered a significant change in the acoustic signature. "Multiple individuals," she whispered urgently. "At least 2, possibly 3 separate sources." The realization that they might be observing a group rather than a single creature added a new dimension to their situation. Matthew's experience with wilderness wildlife had taught him that group behavior often involved different dynamics than solitary animal encounters, including potentially more aggressive territorial responses. Jake's night vision equipment allowed him to track the movements of what appeared to be 3 large figures coordinating their positions around the camp. "They're communicating," he reported quietly. "Definite vocal exchanges and what looks like deliberate positioning." The group behavior continued for approximately 3 hours, during which the creatures maintained their perimeter around the camp while gradually moving closer. Dr. Chen's equipment documented extensive vocal exchanges that included sounds ranging from low rumbles to higher-pitched calls that seemed to carry specific meanings. Around 2 a.m., one of the creatures approached close enough that Matthew could hear its breathing and movement through the undergrowth without electronic assistance. The sounds were definitely not from any wildlife he recognized, with a rhythm and intensity that suggested something much larger than bears or elk. The closest approach occurred when Jake estimated one of the figures had moved to within 30 meters of their position. Through his night vision equipment, he could observe clear details of bipedal locomotion and general body structure that matched the classic Sasquatch description. Upright posture, approximately 8.5 feet tall, massive shoulder development, and locomotion that's definitely humanoid rather than ape-like, Jake reported in barely audible whispers. Hair covering appears dense and dark-colored, possibly brown or black. Dr. Chen's audio equipment was recording everything, and she indicated that the vocal patterns suggested complex communication between the 3 creatures. "This is unprecedented," she whispered. "We're documenting group behavior and communication patterns that could revolutionize our understanding of these creatures." The encounter continued until approximately 4 a.m., when the creatures gradually withdrew deeper into the forest. Unlike the previous night's abrupt departure, this withdrawal seemed more gradual and deliberate, as if the creatures had completed their intended observations and were returning to their normal activities. As dawn broke on their 3rd day, the 3 researchers were exhausted but exhilarated by the previous night's extraordinary documentation. Dr. Chen's equipment had recorded nearly 6 hours of high-quality audio that would provide material for months of analysis. Jake's visual observations had provided the most detailed behavioral descriptions in the research team's database. However, Matthew was beginning to feel an underlying current of unease that went beyond the natural alertness required for wilderness survival. The intelligent, coordinated behavior they had observed suggested they were dealing with creatures that were actively studying them in return. The thought of being subjects of investigation by unknown intelligences was profoundly unsettling. The morning's evidence search revealed even more dramatic findings. Multiple clear footprints were discovered in muddy areas around their camp, showing that the creatures had approached much closer than Jake's visual observations had indicated. Some of the prints were within 15 meters of their sleeping area, suggesting the creatures had conducted detailed reconnaissance while the humans slept. More disturbing were signs that the creatures had manipulated objects around their camp. Rocks had been moved into deliberate patterns, and some of their equipment had been examined. Though nothing was missing or damaged, the message seemed clear. The creatures were demonstrating their ability to access the human camp at will while choosing not to interfere. "This level of intelligence and restraint is remarkable," Dr. Chen noted as they documented the evidence. "They're clearly capable of much more intrusive investigation, but are choosing to maintain what appears to be respectful boundaries." Jake was less impressed by the creature's restraint. The fact that they can get this close without detection suggests we're completely vulnerable if their intentions change. We're dealing with something that outclasses us in every physical capability while apparently matching or exceeding our tactical intelligence. Matthew's wilderness experience was providing a different perspective on their situation. In my experience, most wildlife encounters are resolved by one side or the other withdrawing from the territory. But these creatures seem to be establishing some kind of ongoing relationship with us. That's unprecedented behavior for any wildlife I've encountered. As they prepared for their third night, the group dynamic had shifted noticeably. The excitement of scientific discovery was now balanced by growing awareness of their vulnerability in the creature's territory. Dr. Chen remained focused on documentation and evidence collection, but Jake and Matthew were increasingly concerned about the safety implications of their situation. The weather forecast for the night predicted possible rain and dropping temperatures, conditions that would make observation more difficult while potentially increasing the creature's activity levels. Dr. Chen's research indicated that unsettled weather often correlated with increased cryptid encounters, possibly because atmospheric pressure changes affected behavior patterns. As evening approached, the three established their observation positions with growing anticipation and apprehension. The previous 2 nights had established a pattern of increasingly bold approaches by the creatures, and Matthew's instincts suggested that the third night might bring even closer contact. The forest silence began earlier and was more profound than previous nights, creating an atmosphere of expectation that was almost palpable. Dr. Chen's equipment began registering activity shortly after sunset, but the patterns were different from previous nights. Instead of gradual approach and reconnaissance, the audio signatures suggested the creatures were already positioned close to the camp. "They were waiting for us," Dr. Chen whispered as she monitored her instruments. "The acoustic patterns suggest they established positions before we began our observation period." Jake's night vision equipment confirmed multiple figures positioned at various points around their perimeter, but unlike previous nights, they weren't moving. Instead, they appeared to be maintaining stationary positions, as if waiting for something specific to occur. The standoff continued for nearly 2 hours, with the creatures maintaining their positions while the humans conducted their observations. The tension was becoming increasingly uncomfortable, as if both species were waiting for the other to make the first move in some kind of interspecies negotiation. Around 10 p.m., the situation changed dramatically. Dr. Chen's equipment detected what sounded like additional creatures arriving in the area, expanding the group from 3 to possibly 5 or 6 individuals. More concerning, the new arrivals seemed to be positioning themselves to completely surround the camp. "We're being encircled," Jake reported quietly. "At least 6 positions now, covering all potential escape routes." Matthew's military training was screaming warnings about tactical situations where friendly forces become surrounded by unknown hostiles. However, his wilderness experience suggested that this might be territorial display behavior rather than predatory encirclement. The creatures maintained their positions for another hour while the humans debated their options. Dr. Chen wanted to continue observation and documentation, arguing that this was unprecedented behavior that needed to be recorded. Jake and Matthew were increasingly concerned about the tactical implications of their surrounded position. The resolution came suddenly and unexpectedly. One of the creatures began moving directly toward their camp, approaching much more boldly than any previous contact. Jake's night vision equipment tracked its progress as it moved to within 20 meters of their position before stopping at the edge of the firelight. "Clear visual contact," Jake whispered, his voice tight with controlled fear and excitement. "Approximately 20 meters, fully upright, massive build. It's looking directly at us." Through the darkness, Matthew could now see the creature without electronic assistance. It stood at the edge of their camp's illumination, like a monument of primitive power, at least 8.5 feet tall, with shoulders that seemed impossibly broad. Dark hair covered its entire body, and its face, while hidden in shadow, appeared more human than ape-like. Most remarkable was the creature's obvious intelligence and restraint. It made no threatening gestures or vocalizations, instead maintaining a calm, observant posture that suggested it was making its own scientific observations of the human camp. Dr. Chen's audio equipment was recording the entire encounter, including low-frequency vocalizations that seemed to be communication with the other creatures positioned around the perimeter. The exchange suggested complex coordination and decision-making processes. The face-to-face contact continued for approximately 15 minutes, during which the creature appeared to be systematically observing each human and their equipment. Its attention was particularly focused on Dr. Chen's recording equipment, suggesting it understood the purpose of their expedition. When the creature finally withdrew, it did so with the same deliberate calm it had demonstrated during the approach. The other creatures maintained their positions for another hour before gradually dispersing into the forest, leaving the humans alone with the profound implications of their direct contact. "That was first contact with an unknown intelligence, Doctor," Chen said quietly as they processed what they had experienced. "The behavior patterns we observed suggest cognitive abilities that rival or exceed human capabilities, combined with physical capabilities that far surpass our own." Jake was less philosophical about the implications. "We just had a close encounter with something that could have killed all three of us without breaking stride. The fact that it chose not to doesn't make me feel safer about tomorrow night." Matthew's perspective was shaped by his extensive experience with wildlife behavior. That creature was evaluating us just as much as we were observing it. The question is, what conclusions it reached, and how that will affect future interactions. As they prepared for sleep, the three were acutely aware that their situation had fundamentally changed. They were no longer passive observers conducting research in the creature's territory. They had become active participants in some kind of interspecies contact that carried implications none of them were prepared to handle. The fourth day began with an intensive discussion about whether to continue the expedition as planned or evacuate immediately. Dr. Chen argued that they had achieved unprecedented scientific documentation and should continue while conditions remained favorable. Jake and Matthew were increasingly concerned about the escalating nature of the encounters and their vulnerability in a prolonged contact situation. The morning's evidence search revealed that the creatures had been much more active around their camp than visual observations had indicated. Footprints were found within 10 meters of their sleeping area, and some of their equipment showed signs of careful examination, though nothing was disturbed or damaged. Most significant was the discovery of what appeared to be intentional gifts or offerings left near their camp. Several unusual stones had been arranged in a pattern near their fire ring, and branches had been broken and positioned in ways that seemed clearly deliberate rather than natural. Gift-giving behavior has been documented in previous encounters, Dr. Chen explained as they photographed the arrangements. It suggests these creatures have social protocols for interspecies contact that parallel human cultural practices. However, Matthew's interpretation was more cautious. "In my experience, when wildlife starts leaving evidence of their presence near human camps, it can indicate either curiosity or territorial marking. We need to be very careful about how we interpret these behaviors." As the day progressed, the three noticed subtle changes in the forest environment around their camp. Wildlife activity that had been normal during their first 2 days was now completely absent. Even insect activity seemed reduced, creating an atmosphere of expectant silence that was becoming increasingly oppressive. Jake's security assessment was becoming more pessimistic. We're in a controlled environment now. These creatures have effectively established dominance over this territory and are managing our presence according to their preferences. That puts us in a very vulnerable position if their intentions change. Dr. Chen remained focused on the scientific opportunities, but even she was beginning to acknowledge the risks of their situation. Perhaps we should consider modifying our departure schedule. We have excellent documentation already, and extending our stay might create unnecessary risks. The decision was made for them around mid-afternoon, when Matthew discovered evidence that additional creatures had arrived in the area during the day. Fresh footprints indicated a much larger group than they had been observing, possibly 8 to 10 individuals based on the variety of track sizes and characteristics. "We're looking at a gathering," Matthew concluded as they documented the new evidence. "Multiple family groups or territorial units converging on this location. That's either a normal seasonal behavior or a response to our presence." Jake's military experience suggested the latter. The timing is too coincidental. "We've been observed for 3 days, and now additional forces are arriving. This has all the characteristics of a planned response to our presence." Dr. Chen's research provided disturbing context for this development. Previous expeditions have documented similar gatherings in response to human presence. The outcomes have been variable. That evening, as they prepared for what they had decided would be their final night, the atmosphere in the forest was unlike anything they had experienced. The silence was so complete that it seemed like the entire ecosystem was holding its breath. Even the creek seemed to flow more quietly, as if the normal sounds of nature had been muted by some external force. Dr. Chen's equipment began detecting activity much earlier than previous nights, with audio signatures suggesting a much larger number of creatures than they had previously documented. "At least 10 distinct sources," she reported, "positioned at various distances around our camp in what appears to be a coordinated formation." Jake's night vision equipment confirmed multiple figures visible at the edge of their observation range, but unlike previous nights, these creatures were not attempting concealment. They stood clearly visible at various points around the camp's perimeter, creating an unmistakable message about the humans' surrounded position. "This is a demonstration," Matthew realized. "They're showing us that we're completely under their control while maintaining non-threatening behavior. It's sophisticated psychological warfare." The display continued for several hours, with the creatures maintaining their positions while occasionally exchanging vocalizations. That Dr. Chen's equipment indicated were complex communication exchanges. The humans remained in their camp, acknowledging that any attempt to leave would require the creatures' permission. Around midnight, the situation escalated when several creatures began approaching the camp simultaneously from different directions. Unlike the previous night's single individual contact, this appeared to be a coordinated group approach that suggested very different intentions. Jake's night vision equipment tracked multiple large figures moving closer with each passing minute. At least 4 approaching, possibly more. They're maintaining formation and advancing in a coordinated pattern. Matthew's wilderness instincts were screaming warnings about predatory group behavior, but the creature's movements remained deliberately calm and non-threatening. However, the psychological impact of being approached by multiple 8-foot-tall, unknown creatures in the darkness was overwhelming. Dr. Chen continued recording despite her obvious fear, recognizing that they were documenting unprecedented group behavior that might never be observed again. Whatever happens, we're capturing evidence that will change the scientific understanding of these creatures permanently. The approaching creatures stopped approximately 30 meters from the camp and maintained their positions, while additional vocalizations suggested they were communicating with the creatures positioned around the perimeter. The exchange continued for nearly 30 minutes, during which the humans remained frozen in their observation positions. When the creatures finally withdrew, they did so in the same coordinated fashion they had used to approach. However, their message had been unmistakably clear. The humans were present in the creature's territory by sufferance only, and that sufferance could be withdrawn at any time. "We leave at first light," Matthew announced quietly. "This has moved beyond research into something none of us are prepared to handle." Jake agreed immediately. "We've documented extraordinary evidence, but we're also completely outmatched by whatever we're dealing with. Continuing to push this situation could have consequences we can't predict or control." Dr. Chen was reluctant to abandon the expedition when they were clearly on the verge of even more dramatic contact, but she couldn't argue with the security assessment. "You're right. We have unprecedented documentation already, and the risk-benefit analysis no longer supports continued contact." The remainder of the night passed without further close approaches, but the creatures maintained their presence around the camp until dawn. As morning light began filtering through the forest canopy, the signs of their watchers gradually disappeared, leaving behind only the evidence of their remarkable 4-day encounter. The breakdown of camp proceeded efficiently, with each team member eager to leave the creature's territory before the situation could escalate further. However, as they prepared for departure, Dr. Chen made one final discovery that would haunt all three for years to come. Near the spot where the previous night's group approach had stopped, she found a complex arrangement of stones and branches that had definitely not been present during their arrival. The pattern was clearly intentional and sophisticated, resembling artistic or symbolic communication rather than random environmental manipulation. "This is a message, Doctor," Chen concluded as she photographed the arrangement from multiple angles. The complexity and intentionality suggest these creatures have cultural practices that include symbolic communication. Matthew's interpretation was more ominous. Or it's a warning, a demonstration of their capabilities and presence that we're supposed to carry back to the outside world. As they began the long hike back to their vehicles, all three were acutely aware that they were being observed and escorted from the territory. Occasional glimpses of movement in the forest and the continued absence of normal wildlife indicated that their departure was being carefully monitored. The psychological impact of their experience was becoming apparent as they put distance between themselves and the encounter site. The adrenaline that had sustained them through 4 days of unprecedented contact was giving way to exhaustion and the delayed stress response that follows survival situations. Jake was the first to verbalize what they were all feeling. "We were never in control of that situation. From the moment we entered their territory, every aspect of our experience was being managed and directed by creatures with capabilities we can't match." Dr. Chen's scientific training was helping her process the experience more analytically. The behavioral patterns we observed suggest a species with cognitive abilities that rival human intelligence, but combined with physical capabilities and environmental knowledge that far exceed our own. The implications for anthropology and primatology are staggering. Matthew's perspective was shaped by his wilderness experience and growing concern about the broader implications of their contact. The question is what we do with this information. These creatures have made it clear they're aware of human presence and are capable of managing contact on their own terms. That changes everything about how we approach wilderness areas. The hike back to their vehicles took nearly 8 hours, during which they continued to feel observed, despite the gradually increasing distance from the encounter site. Normal forest wildlife began to reappear only after they had covered approximately half the distance to the trailhead. As they loaded their gear into their vehicles at the Timberline Lodge parking area, the contrast between the civilized world and their wilderness experience was jarring. Other hikers were preparing for day trips, completely unaware that they were entering territory inhabited by unknown intelligences with capabilities that defied conventional understanding. Dr. Chen's preliminary review of her audio recordings during the drive back to Portland revealed that they had documented over 20 hours of unusual vocalizations, including complex communication patterns that would require months of analysis to interpret fully. The photographic evidence of footprints and environmental manipulations was equally unprecedented. However, as they discussed the implications of their expedition, all three were grappling with the responsibility of their discoveries. The evidence they had collected could potentially prove the existence of an unknown species, but it could also trigger human intrusion into the creature's territory that might have catastrophic consequences for both species. Matthew's experience with wilderness areas had taught him that human contact with previously unknown wildlife populations often resulted in habitat destruction and species disruption. The thought of their discovery leading to invasion of the creature's territory by researchers, media, and thrill seekers was deeply troubling. Jake's military background provided a different perspective on the security implications. If these creatures are as intelligent and capable as our observations suggest, human intrusion into their territory could result in conflict situations that we're not prepared to handle. We could be documenting the first contact with a species that views humans as the invasive threat. Dr. Chen was facing the classic researcher's dilemma of balancing scientific responsibility with ethical concerns about the consequences of disclosure. The scientific community has a right to this evidence, but we also have a responsibility to consider the welfare of the species we've encountered. As they reached Portland and prepared to part ways, the three made a preliminary agreement to maintain confidentiality about their specific findings, while Dr. Chen prepared a careful analysis of their evidence. The decision about broader disclosure would be made only after thorough consideration of the ethical and practical implications. However, Matthew was already experiencing the psychological aftermath of their encounter in ways that would affect the rest of his life. Sleep became elusive as his dreams were filled with images of massive figures watching from forest shadows. His confidence in wilderness environments was shaken by the knowledge that humans were not the apex predators they assumed themselves to be in remote areas. Jake's response was more pragmatic but equally profound. His entire understanding of potential threats in wilderness environments had been revolutionized by their experience. The creatures they had encountered possessed capabilities that rendered conventional security measures meaningless, forcing a complete reassessment of risk evaluation in remote areas. Dr. Chen threw herself into analysis of their evidence with the intensity of someone who knew she was dealing with career-defining material. However, she was also struggling with the weight of knowledge that could fundamentally change human understanding of our place in the natural world. 3 weeks after their return, Matthew was contacted by Dr. Chen with disturbing news. Analysis of their audio recordings had revealed evidence that their conversations throughout the expedition had been monitored by the creatures. Frequency analysis indicated that vocalizations had been recorded during periods when the creatures were positioned close enough to overhear human conversations. They understood that we were documenting them, and they were documenting us in return, Dr. Chen explained during a tense meeting at her university office. The intelligence level we're dealing with is far beyond what any of us anticipated. Jake's response was immediate and practical. If they understood our communications, they know our names, our professions, and our intentions. They also know we have evidence of their existence. That gives them significant leverage in any future contact situations. The implications were staggering. The creatures were not simply unknown animals that had been accidentally discovered by human researchers. They were intelligent beings who had made deliberate decisions about contact with humans, including allowing themselves to be documented while simultaneously gathering intelligence about their human observers. Matthew's wilderness experience provided context for this revelation that was deeply unsettling. Most wildlife encounters involve animals that react instinctively to human presence. But these creatures were conducting strategic intelligence gathering while managing our perceptions of the contact. That's military-level planning capability. Dr. Chen's further analysis revealed even more sophisticated behavior patterns. The timing and nature of their approaches suggest they were testing our reactions and capabilities throughout the expedition. Each night's contact was designed to gather specific information about human behavior under stress. The three were forced to confront the possibility that they had not discovered an unknown species so much as they had been evaluated by representatives of that species who had decided to reveal themselves selectively. The power dynamic of their entire expedition had been the reverse of what they had assumed. As months passed, each member of the expedition dealt with their experience differently. Matthew found that his wilderness guiding business was affected by his changed perspective on forest environments. He became increasingly reluctant to lead clients into remote areas where unknown intelligences might be observing human activities. Jake's security consulting work took on new dimensions as he began developing threat assessment protocols for situations involving unknown capabilities and intelligences. His military experience had prepared him for human adversaries, but the creatures they had encountered represented a completely different category of potential security concerns. Dr. Jen's academic career was transformed by her careful analysis of their evidence, but she remained bound by ethical concerns about disclosure that prevented her from sharing her most significant findings. The contradiction between her scientific responsibilities and her concern for the creature's welfare created ongoing professional and personal stress. A year after their expedition, Matthew received a phone call that would change his understanding of their experience even more dramatically. A tribal elder from the Warm Springs Reservation contacted him, explaining that the tribal council was aware of his encounter and wanted to discuss its implications. The meeting with tribal representatives revealed that Matthew's expedition had been observed not only by the creatures themselves, but also by indigenous monitors who maintained ongoing relationships with what they termed the forest people. The human expedition had been allowed to proceed because tribal representatives had vouched for the researchers' respectful intentions. "Your people are still learning what our people have always known," the elder explained. "The forest people have been our neighbors for thousands of years. They allowed you to see them because they want your people to understand that the forests are not empty wilderness but shared territory." This revelation forced Matthew to reconsider every aspect of their expedition. They had not stumbled upon an unknown species in unexplored territory. They had been granted permission by both the indigenous human inhabitants and the non-human residents to experience carefully managed contact as part of an ongoing interspecies relationship. The tribal elder's explanation provided context for the creature's sophisticated behavior and their apparent familiarity with human technology and intentions. "They have been watching your people for as long as your people have been in their territory. They understand your capabilities and intentions better than you understand theirs. Matthew's role as an interpreter between the scientific community and indigenous knowledge holders became an unexpected consequence of his expedition. He found himself serving as a bridge between Dr. Chen's research and tribal representatives who possessed generations of accumulated knowledge about the creatures. However, this role also brought responsibility for maintaining the delicate balance between scientific inquiry and respect for both indigenous sovereignty and the creature's autonomy. The forest people had made it clear through tribal intermediaries that they would control any future contact according to their own preferences and priorities. Jake's involvement in developing security protocols for cryptid encounters became increasingly important as reports of similar experiences emerged from other wilderness areas throughout the Pacific Northwest. His military background and direct experience made him a valuable consultant for government agencies that were quietly investigating similar phenomena. The existence of official interest in cryptid encounters was itself a revelation that added new dimensions to the implications of Matthew's expedition. Government agencies had been aware of and monitoring such phenomena for decades, maintaining careful secrecy while gathering intelligence about non-human intelligences, sharing North American wilderness areas. Dr. Chen's research continued under the auspices of a classified government program that allowed her to share her findings with a select community of researchers while maintaining public confidentiality. Her expedition documentation became part of a growing database of evidence that would inform government policy regarding cryptid populations. However, the psychological impact of her experience remained profound and ongoing. The knowledge that humans shared their environment with intelligent beings possessing superior physical capabilities and sophisticated understanding of human behavior was fundamentally unsettling in ways that continued to affect her daily life. 2 years after the expedition, Matthew received another contact that provided final context for their experience. A researcher from the government program contacted him with information that their encounter had been part of a broader pattern of managed disclosure that the creatures themselves were orchestrating. They're conducting their own research program, the researcher explained, selecting specific humans for contact and observation while gathering intelligence about human society and intentions. Your expedition was part of their data collection effort. This revelation completed Matthew's understanding of their experience while raising even more profound questions about the future of human cryptid relationships. The creatures were not passive subjects of human research, but active participants in interspecies contact who were pursuing their own agenda while allowing humans to think they were in control of the discovery process. The implications extended far beyond the scientific community into questions of sovereignty, territory rights, and the fundamental assumptions underlying human dominance over wilderness areas. The forest people had demonstrated that humans were not the only intelligent species capable of strategic planning and technological adaptation in North American environments. Matthew's continuing relationship with tribal representatives provided insight into the complex protocols that had been developed over generations for managing human-cryptid coexistence. These relationships involved mutual respect, territorial agreements, and sophisticated communication systems that paralleled international diplomacy between human nations. However, the increasing human population and development pressure on wilderness areas was creating new challenges for maintaining traditional coexistence patterns. The forest people were being forced to make decisions about more direct contact with human authorities as their territory continued to shrink under development pressure. Jake's work with government agencies revealed that official policy regarding cryptid populations was evolving rapidly in response to increasing contact reports and evidence accumulation. The traditional approach of denial and secrecy was becoming untenable as evidence mounted and contact incidents became more frequent. The government's primary concern was maintaining public stability while developing appropriate response protocols for dealing with intelligent non-human populations that possessed capabilities beyond human defensive measures. The forest people represented both an unprecedented opportunity for interspecies cooperation and a potential security threat that required careful management. Dr. Chen's research indicated that the creatures possessed not only superior physical capabilities, but also technological knowledge that surpassed human understanding in several key areas. Their ability to avoid detection by human surveillance systems suggested sophisticated understanding of electronic equipment and countermeasure techniques. 3 years after the expedition, Matthew was invited to participate in the first official interspecies communication attempt between government representatives and forest people delegates. The meeting location was carefully chosen neutral territory that satisfied both human security requirements and cryptid territorial protocols. The communication session revealed that the forest people had been monitoring human technological development and social evolution for decades, while making strategic decisions about appropriate levels of contact. Their civilization possessed sophisticated understanding of human society, combined with capabilities that enabled them to remain hidden while maintaining intelligence-gathering operations. Most remarkably, the forest people demonstrated technological capabilities that suggested scientific knowledge rivaling or exceeding human achievements in several fields. Their understanding of environmental systems, biological processes, and sustainable resource management far surpassed human knowledge accumulated through formal scientific research. The communication sessions established preliminary protocols for ongoing contact while addressing territorial concerns and mutual security interests. However, the forest people made it clear that any expansion of human knowledge about their existence would be controlled according to their own timeline and priorities. Matthew's role as a liaison between the various parties involved in interspecies contact became a permanent responsibility that transformed his life completely. His wilderness guide business evolved into specialized consulting for government agencies and research institutions dealing with cryptid populations. Jake's security expertise became essential for developing protocols that could protect both species during contact situations while preventing unauthorized human intrusion into cryptid territories. His military background provided valuable perspective on managing first contact situations between populations with significantly different capabilities. Dr. Chen's scientific research continued under increasingly classified conditions as evidence accumulated that cryptid populations existed throughout North America with varying levels of technological sophistication and territorial organization. Her expedition documentation had become foundational material for understanding cryptid behavior and capabilities. However, the personal cost of their involvement in interspecies contact remained significant for all 3 expedition members. The knowledge they carried about the true nature of wilderness areas and the non-human intelligences that inhabited them created ongoing psychological stress and social isolation. 5 years after their expedition, Matthew's life had been completely transformed by the consequences of their 4-day wilderness encounter. He had become a specialist in cryptid-human relations with responsibilities that extended far beyond his original profession as a wilderness guide. The forest people had demonstrated that humans were not alone on Earth, and that intelligent non-human populations had been successfully maintaining their own civilizations while remaining hidden from human awareness. The implications for human understanding of our place in the world were profound and ongoing. Jake's work had evolved into developing comprehensive security protocols for managing contact with multiple cryptid populations throughout North America. Each population possessed distinct capabilities and territorial requirements that necessitated specialized approach strategies. Dr. Chen's research had revealed that cryptid populations maintained sophisticated intergroup communication systems that enabled coordinated responses to human activities across vast geographical areas. The level of organization and technological capability suggested civilizations with histories potentially extending back millennia. The expedition that had begun as routine wildlife research had evolved into participation in first contact between human civilization and established non-human intelligences that possessed superior capabilities and comprehensive understanding of human society. The psychological and social implications continued to affect all three participants years after their initial encounter. Matthew's current role involved managing ongoing diplomatic contact between government agencies and forest people representatives, while protecting the confidentiality requirements that both species considered essential for successful coexistence. His wilderness experience had become the foundation for interspecies diplomacy, with implications that extended far beyond the original expedition. The forest people's decision to reveal themselves selectively to specific humans appeared to be part of a long-term strategy for managing inevitable increased contact as human development continued to encroach on traditional cryptid territories. Their superior intelligence and capabilities gave them significant advantages in controlling the terms and timeline of disclosure. However, the fundamental questions raised by interspecies contact remained unresolved. The existence of intelligent non-human populations with advanced capabilities challenged basic human assumptions about our role as the dominant species on Earth, while creating unprecedented opportunities for learning and cooperation. Matthew's continuing contact with the forest people provided ongoing education about the complexity and sophistication of non-human civilization that had remained hidden while maintaining detailed knowledge of human society and technological development. Their patient observation and strategic planning suggested planning capabilities that operated on timescales far longer than typical human, political, or economic cycles. The expedition that had begun with Dr. Chen's research proposal had become a catalyst for fundamental changes in human understanding of our relationship with the natural world and our place among the intelligences that inhabit Earth. The implications continued to evolve as contact protocols developed and interspecies relationships became more formally established. Years later, Matthew would reflect on the profound irony that his career as a wilderness guide, dedicated to helping humans navigate and survive in natural environments, had led to the discovery that humans were not the only intelligent navigators of those environments. The forest people had been observing and managing human wilderness activities for generations while remaining invisible to human awareness. The flashlight incident that had originally marked the climax of their encounter had become just the beginning of a relationship that would continue to evolve as both species learned to navigate the complex challenges and opportunities of acknowledged coexistence. The red eyes that had initially terrified Matthew had become windows into an intelligence that would fundamentally change human understanding of our world and our place within it.